He threw her luggage off the platform himself. Not a porter. Not a stranger. The man who had written her 6 letters. The man who had signed his name beside hers on a legal agreement. The man who had promised her a home. Wesley Hartman picked up Adeline Mercer's travel trunk with both hands, walked to the edge of the station platform, and dropped it into the snow below like it was garbage he was tired of looking at. Then he turned back to her, straightened his coat, and said, in front of every soul standing on that platform in Harrow Creek, "Montana, you're not what I paid for. We're done. Nobody moved." Nobody said a word, and that was the moment Caleb Whitaker decided he'd seen enough. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along to the very end, because what happens next will shake you to your core. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every comment, every subscribe, it means the world to me, and I promise you, we are just getting started. Caleb had not planned to be at the station that afternoon. He had supplies to pick up from Dunmore's general store: flour, salt, coffee, an iron latch for the barn door that had been hanging wrong since October. Simple errands. The kind of thing a man does and gets back from before the light goes bad. Because in Montana in February of 1888, the light went bad early, and the cold that followed it was not the kind you argued with. He was crossing the main street toward Dunmore's when he heard the train come in. And he stopped not because he cared about the train, but because the crowd that gathered at the platform was behaving strangely. Too still, too quiet. The particular stillness of people watching something they knew was wrong and had collectively decided not to interfere with. Caleb changed direction. He came around the corner of the feed store and saw it all at once. The woman standing at the far edge of the platform in a green traveling coat. Her dark hair pinned precisely beneath a hat that had been beautiful once. She was very straight, very still. The kind of stillness that is not calm but is the thing a person holds onto when calm is no longer available. In the snow below the platform, her trunk lay on its side, the brass latches glinting where it had landed. A few of her belongings had spilled out through a gap in the lid: a white blouse, a book, something wrapped in brown paper that was already getting wet from the snow. Wesley Hartman stood 3 feet away from her, dusting his gloved hands together like he'd just finished a dirty job. "You have $20 in that envelope," he said, nodding toward the small white rectangle lying in the snow near her feet. He'd thrown that too. Caleb realized. Thrown it at her feet like you'd throw a scrap to a dog. "That's generous, considering. Take it and sort yourself out. I don't want to see you in this town. You signed an agreement," Adeline said. Her voice was even, remarkably even, given everything. "A legal agreement. I have the letters. Letters aren't binding." Wesley's voice was the voice of a man who had never lost an argument because he'd never allowed one to happen. "An agreement with a woman who misrepresented herself isn't worth the paper it's on. I misrepresented nothing. Your photograph was flattering." His eyes moved over her with the cold, clinical assessment of a man evaluating livestock he'd decided not to purchase. "The reality is considerably less so. And you're older than you claimed. I am 26 years old. Which is exactly what I told you in every letter. I'm not going to stand here and debate this with you." He turned away, toward the 2 ranch hands who had ridden in with him and were now studying the ground with careful attention. The way men study the ground when they want no part of what's happening, but also have no intention of stopping it. "Come on, boys, we're done here." He walked away. Just like that. He turned his back on her and he walked away down the platform. And the crowd parted for him the way crowds part for men with money and no conscience. And in 30 seconds he was gone. The platform went very quiet. Adeline stood exactly where she was. She did not move. She did not look around at the people watching her. She looked at the white envelope lying in the snow below the platform edge. And Caleb watched her face do something that no one else on that platform seemed to be paying attention to: a single, Rapid sequence of expressions, there and gone in under 2 seconds. Shock, first, then something that might have been the beginning of tears. Ruthlessly suppressed, then a kind of terrible quiet settling. Like a person reorganizing themselves around a new and unwelcome reality. She climbed down from the platform herself. No one helped her. She retrieved the trunk. She picked up the envelope. She gathered her belongings from the snow, the blouse, the book, the brown paper package, all of it, and repacked them with steady hands. Then she straightened up, put the envelope in her coat pocket, picked up her travel bag, and stood in the snow with nowhere to go. Nobody moved. Caleb was already walking toward her before he'd made a conscious decision to do it. "Ma'am," he said. She turned. Up close, her eyes were dark brown and sharp with the particular intelligence of someone who has survived things by paying very careful attention to everything around them. She looked at him with zero expectation. That was the thing that hit him first, not the cold dignity of her expression, or the precise way she was holding herself together, but the complete and total absence of hope in how she looked at him. She was not waiting for rescue. She had already stopped waiting for rescue. She was simply trying to calculate, behind those careful eyes, what the next problem was and how to manage it. "I don't need charity," she said. Before he could open his mouth. "I wasn't offering any," Caleb said. "I was going to ask if you have a place to stay tonight." A pause. "No. The hotel on Main Street takes women travelers. Mrs. Finch runs it. She's fair and she's decent." He glanced at the sky, which had gone the flat, particular gray that every person who had lived through a Montana winter recognized immediately. "But the storm that's coming is going to be the bad kind. The kind that doesn't care about walls that aren't solid." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it's true." "Caleb Whitaker," he said. "I have a ranch about 4 miles out. Nothing fancy. My hired hand, Pete Garner, uses the spare room when he's in from the bunkhouse. It's empty right now. You'd have your own room, a solid door with a lock, and 4 walls that have stood through 11 winters." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to pretend I make a habit of this. But I'm also not going to stand here and watch a woman freeze because a rich fool decided his convenience mattered more than his word." She studied him, the way she'd been studying everything since she stepped off that train, carefully, without illusion. "What do you want in return?" she asked. "Nothing. Men always want something." "I reckon that's been true in your experience," he said. "I can only speak to mine." He nodded toward the supply wagon he'd left in front of Dunmore's. "I've got to load my supplies. 20 minutes, maybe. If you decide you want to ride out to the ranch, I'll be that wagon." He tipped his hat. "If you decide you don't, I understand that too. That's your right." He walked back to Dunmore's. He collected his flour, his salt, his coffee, his iron latch. He paid Marcus Dunmore, who gave him a long look over the counter and said nothing, which Caleb appreciated. He loaded the wagon. He climbed up into the seat. She was standing beside the wagon. Her trunk was at her feet. Her travel bag was in her hand. Her chin was up, not defiantly, exactly, but with the careful, maintained dignity of a woman who had decided that the world did not get to see her break. "I would like to accept your offer," she said, "if it still stands." "It stands," he said. "Hand me the trunk." She hesitated just for a moment. The flicker of someone unaccustomed to accepting help, and then she handed it up to him. He loaded it into the wagon bed, and she climbed up to the seat beside him. And they pulled out of Harrow Creek as the first real snow began to fall. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. The snow came down steadily around them, muffling the sound of the horses and the creak of the wagon wheels. And the town shrank behind them and disappeared, and Caleb kept his eyes on the road and gave her whatever silence she needed. She broke it herself. "My name is Adeline Mercer," she said. "I'm from Philadelphia originally, more recently Cincinnati." A pause. "I answered his advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette." He described himself as a man of integrity. Her voice was flat. precisely controlled, each word placed like she was walking across uncertain ground. He wrote 6 letters. They were, he seemed, thoughtful. "I should have known better." "How would you have known?" Caleb said. "I should have—" "He's a man who writes what a woman needs to hear to get what he wants," Caleb said. "That's on him, not you." She was quiet for a moment. "You say that like it's simple," she said. "It is simple," he said. "Doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. But the wrongness of it is simple." He kept his eyes on the road. "He made a promise. He broke it. He humiliated you in public to make himself feel better about breaking it. Every piece of that is his character, not yours." The snow was coming harder now. The horses were picking up their pace instinctively, the way horses do when they know shelter is ahead and weather is behind. "What do you know about me?" Adeline said, not hostile. Genuinely asking. "You watched 30 seconds of that. And now you're making pronouncements about my character." "I watched enough," Caleb said. "Enough to decide I was worth the trouble of a 4-mile ride in a snowstorm? Enough to decide you weren't the one who deserved to be left in it." He glanced at her sideways. "Briefly, there's a difference." She looked at him for a moment. And he looked back at the road, and something shifted slightly in the silence, between them, not dramatically. Not in any way that could be named precisely, but it shifted. "What's on that list?" she asked, after another stretch of quiet. She was looking at the scrap of brown paper still sticking out of his coat pocket. "Supplies," he said. "I can see that." "What kind?" He pulled it out and handed it to her. She looked at it, and then she looked at him, and something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood, crossed her face. "You came into town for an iron latch and 40 pounds of staple goods," she said. "And you came home with a stranger." "Appears so," he said. "Pete's going to have opinions about that." "Pete always has opinions," he said. "It doesn't stop things from being what they are." The ranch came into view through the thickening snow small. Dark-logged, a line of smoke rising from the chimney where he'd banked the fire before he left that morning. The barn beyond it, the fence lines disappearing into white. Nothing grand, nothing like what Wesley Hartman's letters had apparently described. He watched her look at it. "It's good land," he said, and heard the slight gruffness in his own voice that appeared when he cared about something more than he intended to. "I can see that," she said, simple. No pity in it. No performance of enthusiasm. Just a genuine observation from a woman who was looking at what was actually in front of her rather than what she wished was there. Something about that unknotted a small tension in his chest he hadn't known was there. He unhitched the horses and got them into the barn. And then he led her inside. Warm air hit them both at the door the banked fire had held through the day, filling the main room with a heat that felt, after the brutal cold outside, almost violent in its comfort. Adeline stopped just inside the doorway, and he watched her eyes close for just a second, involuntary. Unguarded, the pure physical relief of warmth after cold before she opened them again and looked around. Main room with a stone fireplace, kitchen table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books, tools racked near the door, functional. Clean in the way of a man who organizes his life around usefulness. Not comfort. "The back room on the left is yours," he said. "There's a bolt on the inside of the door. I want you to use it." She turned and looked at him. "Not because I don't trust myself," he said directly, "but because you don't know me, and you should sleep without wondering. Use the bolt." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "I'll get the fire built up properly," he said, moving toward the hearth. "I'll do it," she said. He stopped. Looked at her. "I'm not helpless," she said, and the flatness in her voice was not rudeness. It was the tone of a woman who had said this sentence many times to many people and needed it to be understood quickly. "I've been building fires since I was 12. My father lost our furnace in a business deal gone wrong. And we spent a winter with a fireplace and nothing else." She set down her bag and knelt at the hearth. "I've built quite a few fires since then." He stepped back. "All right." She built it fast and well, not tentatively. Not experimentally, but with the efficiency of someone doing something they have done. So many times it has become purely physical. The hands knowing what to do without consulting the mind. Within 4 minutes, the fire was going properly, the kind of solid, settled burn that would hold through the night. He watched her from the kitchen doorway without trying to hide that he was watching. She stood up, brushed her hands on her coat, and caught him looking. "What?" she said. He said. "Tea," she said. "Please." They sat at the kitchen table with their cups, and the storm closed in fully around the cabin, and the wind began doing what Montana wind does in February, throwing itself at every wall with a kind of personal animosity, finding every gap and crack, making the cabin feel simultaneously very small and very necessary. "You said Pete," Adeline said, "your hired hand." "He's been with me 6 years," Caleb said. "He's in town tonight, but he'll be back when the storm clears. He's straightforward. He says what he thinks." He paused. "I'm warning you so you're not startled." "I appreciate straightforward," she said. "I've had enough of its opposite." "He won't be unkind," Caleb said. "I want to be clear about that. Pete Garner has his opinions. But he's not cruel." Adeline looked at her cup. "And what will he think about this situation?" "He'll think I did the right thing," Caleb said. "Might take him 20 minutes to get there, but he'll get there." She was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. The wind hit the north wall hard and rattled the small window above the kitchen basin. "I need to find my brother," she said suddenly. She said it like she'd been holding it for a while, and it had gotten too heavy. "Thomas. He went west 2 years ago, Nevada originally. Then I lost the address. If I can locate him," she stopped, pressed her lips together, started again more carefully. "I don't intend to be a burden to you. I want you to know that. This is temporary. You're not a burden," Caleb said. She looked up at him. "I mean that literally, not as a nicety," he said. "You built that fire faster and better than I would have. I suspect you can cook better than I can, which is not a high bar but is a relevant one. And I've been meaning to track down that roof leak for 2 years, and something tells me you'd have found it in a week." He looked at her steadily. "You're not a burden, Adeline. You're a capable person in a bad situation. Those are different things." She stared at him. He had the impression, watching her face, that she was doing something difficult, without flinching away from it, without deflecting it with some small self-deprecating phrase that would make it smaller, and therefore safer. "Thank you," she said, just that. 2 words placed quietly and precisely, with a weight behind them that told him they cost something. "You're welcome," he said, and looked back at his tea. Because he was a man who knew when to let a moment be. The next 3 days established a pattern. Adeline was up before him every morning. He discovered this on the 2nd day, when he came out of his room at first light to find coffee made, the fire stoked, and something on the stove that smelled considerably better than anything he would have produced. She was at the kitchen table with a piece of paper, writing, and she looked up without self-consciousness when he appeared. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I didn't know what you had, so I worked with what I found. There's cornmeal and salt pork in the left cupboard. I made porridge. It's not exciting, but it's hot. I don't mind," he said. He looked at the coffee, and at the fire, and at the orderly kitchen that looked considerably more organized than it had the night before. "I don't mind at all." She cooked the way his mother had once cooked, not showily, not with comment or performance, but with the focused, purposeful attention of someone who understood that feeding people was a serious matter. She took the same ingredients he'd been eating in grim rotation for months and produced things that were, by any honest accounting, genuinely good. He told her so. On the 3rd morning, "My mother," she said simply. She believed that how you cooked for people was how you loved them. When we had food, it was always good. She was looking at the stove rather than at him. "She died 4 years ago. I cooked for my father after that. And then for my brother," until she stopped. A pause that lasted just long enough for him to understand it was deliberate. She was deciding how much to give. Until there was no one left to cook for. "What happened to your father?" he asked. He decided early that he would ask when she opened a door, rather than wait in silence for her to walk through it herself. "He died 8 months after my mother," she said. "The business had already failed by then. I think he didn't want to be here after her. The debt ate everything. The house, the furniture. Everything she had." Her voice was steady, factual. "Thomas stayed for a month, and then he couldn't find work in Cincinnati. And he went west, and I found the job with the seamstress. And I put away what I could, and then I saw the advertisement. And you answered it." "I answered it," she said. She turned from the stove and looked at him with the directness that he was coming to understand was simply how she was not bold. Exactly, not aggressive, but constitutionally incapable of being indirect when direct was available. "I wasn't naive about it. I knew it wasn't a romance. I was prepared for practical over warm, functional over comfortable." A pause. "I was not prepared for contempt." Before he'd spoken 10 words to me. "What did he say?" Lub asked. "On the platform." Before she was quiet for a moment. "He said I was older than my photograph suggested." She looked back at the stove. "I am 26, he is 43, another pause. And then he said I was plain." The word landed in the kitchen like a stone in still water. Caleb looked at her. He looked at her the way he looked at everything he was forming an honest opinion of directly. Without sentimentality, without the social decorations that people put on their observations to make them more acceptable. He looked at her eyes, which were dark and quick and full of more life than most faces he'd encountered. He looked at the line of her jaw, the quality of her attention, the way she stood in his kitchen with a wooden spoon in her hand and met his gaze without flinching. "That man," Caleb said, "is a fool." She blinked. "I don't say that to make you feel better," he said. "I say it because it's a factual assessment. A man who stands in front of a woman like you and uses the word plain is a man who doesn't know how to see what's in front of him. That's his deficiency, not yours." The kitchen was very quiet. "A woman like me," she repeated carefully. "A woman who rebuilt her life 3 separate times before she was 26, he said. Who builds fires and cooks meals and writes letters and doesn't break down in the snow when a man humiliates her in public. Even when breaking down would be entirely reasonable." He picked up his coffee cup. "Wesley Hartman wouldn't know what to do with a woman like that. He wants something decorative that stays in place. That's his limitation, don't carry it." Adeline looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, complicated and layered. The way real emotion is complicated and layered, nothing like the clean single-note feelings that stories usually allowed their characters. "You are a very unusual man, Caleb Whitaker," she said. "I'm a straightforward man," he said. "People mistake that for unusual." She looked at him a moment longer. Then something happened that he had not seen yet. In 3 days, she smiled. Not a careful managed, socially appropriate smile, but a real one, sudden and warm and slightly surprised at itself. Like it had arrived before she'd decided to allow it. "Sit down," she said. "Your porridge is getting cold." He sat. Pete came back on the 4th day, when the storm broke and the snow lay deep and crystalline, and the sky went a hard, brilliant blue that Montana sky only went in deep winter. He came through the door in a gust of cold air, and stopped when he saw Adeline at the kitchen table, with a book from Caleb's shelf, a Dickens novel. Cracked open and clearly not for the first time. Pete looked at her. He looked at Caleb. He looked back at her. "Morning." "Miss," he said, with the easy, unperformed courtesy of a man who had lived enough not to be ruffled by the unexpected. "Good morning," Adeline said. She had been reading a tense scene, he could tell by the way she'd been leaning forward slightly, and she marked her place with a careful finger and gave Pete her full attention. Which was, he was learning, one of the things she did when she thought something mattered. Pete hung up his coat. He poured coffee. He came back to the main room and sat in the chair nearest the fire. Town's talking, he said to Caleb. Flat factual. Say what they're saying, Caleb said. Hartman's been working the story his way, Pete said. Telling people the woman misrepresented herself and refused his reasonable settlement. That she attached herself to you. He sipped his coffee. Some folks are choosing to believe him because it don't cost them anything not to. He looked at Adeline. No offense intended, miss, none taken, Adeline said. Her voice was steady, and her hands in her lap were still. But Caleb noticed she had closed the book. I've learned not to be surprised when a man with money writes his own version of events. Pete studied her for a long beat. He was a man who prided himself on reading people quickly and accurately. 40 years of frontier life required it. She's smart, he said to Caleb. I know, Caleb said. Hartman's not going to leave it alone, Pete said. He was looking at the fire now. That's the other thing I came to say. He's not a man who tolerates he searched for the right word narratives he didn't write. He's going to do something about this. A pause. I don't know what yet. But something. The fire popped. Outside, the brilliant cold day was completely indifferent to all of it. Caleb looked at Adeline. She was looking at the table not with defeat, but with the calculating attention of a woman working through a problem. Let him, she said. Both men looked at her. She looked up. Her chin was doing the thing again, that quarter-inch lift. Let him come. Let him say whatever he intends to say. Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge in it that hadn't been there before. Something new, something that had apparently been waiting for exactly this information to arrive. I have his letters. I have the agreement with his signature. I have 11 days of travel receipts and a platform full of witnesses who saw what he did. She looked at Caleb. I was frightened when I got off that train. I'm not frightened anymore. Caleb held her gaze. Something had changed in her. He could see it, and he understood it. Because he had watched it happen over 4 days of small moments. The fire she built, the meals she cooked, the book she read. The letter she was writing to her brother. She had been arriving, piece by piece, back into herself, back into the woman she was before 11 days on a train and 30 seconds on a platform had tried to reduce her to an inconvenience in another man's story. All right, he said. All right, she repeated. If he comes, Caleb said. We deal with it. He said it simply, the way he said most things. Without ornament or excess. That's all. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind shifted a subtle change, the kind that old ranchers noticed before they could explain why. It came from the north, sharp and purposeful, carrying with it the faintest suggestion of what was still to come. Pete noticed it too. He set down his cup and looked at the window. Second storm, he said quietly, bigger than the first. But inside the cabin, the fire burned steady and certain, and no one moved to leave. And somewhere in Harrow Creek, 4 miles away, Wesley Hartman was sitting in his fine house, with his ranch hands and his money, and his uncomplicated certainty that the world would rearrange itself to his satisfaction. The way it always had. He was already deciding what to do next. He just didn't know yet that the woman he'd thrown away in the snow had landed on her feet. And that the man she'd landed near was not the kind of man who stepped aside when trouble came calling. The morning after Pete's warning, Adeline found the letter. It was not addressed to her. It was sitting on the kitchen table when she came out at first light, weighted down by Caleb's coffee cup, like he'd read it and set it there deliberately. Or maybe like he'd read it and forgotten it in the distraction of getting to the barn before the second storm got worse. Either way, it was there, and her name was in it, and she read it before she'd fully decided whether she should. It was from Reverend Douglas Hale of the Harrow Creek Community Church. 3 paragraphs, neat handwriting, the careful tone of a man who believed he was doing something righteous. The first paragraph expressed concern for the moral character of the community. The second paragraph referenced, without naming her directly, the presence of a woman of uncertain standing living in the home of an unmarried man. The third paragraph strongly suggested that Caleb consider the damage being done to his reputation and to the reputation of his neighbors, and encouraged him to make arrangements that were more appropriate to the standards of a decent Christian settlement. Adeline set the letter down. She stood at the kitchen table for a long moment. Then she started the fire, made the coffee, and put the salt pork on. Caleb came in from the barn at 7:30, stamping snow off his boots, and stopped when he saw her face. "You read it," he said. "It was on the table," she said. "I'm sorry." "No," he said. He crossed to the table, picked up the letter, and dropped it into the fire without reading it again. "It's handled." She turned from the stove and stared at him. "Caleb, that was from the Reverend. I know who it was from." "I can," he said. And his voice was not angry, exactly, but it had a finality in it that she was learning to recognize the voice of a man who had made a decision by his own measure and was not interested in renegotiating it. Hale can write as many letters as he wants. It doesn't change what's right. He poured coffee and sat at the table. "Are those eggs?" she said. She turned back to the stove. She was quiet for a moment. "Then, people are going to make your life difficult because of me." "People were already making my life difficult," Caleb said. "The fence on the North Ridge has been a problem since September. I've got a pump that's going to fail before spring. Pete's thinking about California." He picked up his cup. "A few letters from Douglas Hale barely register. This is not the same thing, and you know it," she said. She set his plate in front of him with perhaps slightly more force than was strictly necessary. She sat across from him. "Is my concern," he said. "Not yours. It became mine the minute I walked through that door." He looked at her across the table. She looked back. Neither of them dropped it. "Adeline," he said. "Don't," she said. "Don't tell me not to worry about it. Don't be reasonable and calm about it. I know what it means for a man in a small town to have people like Reverend Hale writing him letters. I know what it means for his business, for his relationships. For his—" She stopped, her jaw tightened. "I've cost you enough already." "You haven't cost me anything," he said. "I've cost you your uncomplicated life." The words sat between them. He looked at his plate. She looked at her hands. "My life wasn't uncomplicated," he said finally. It was quiet. "Those aren't the same thing." He picked up his fork. "Eat something." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she picked up her fork. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, thicker. More aware of itself, the silence of two people who had just said something real and were still absorbing it. 3 days passed. The second storm blew through and left and took the worst of the cold with it. And Harrow Creek thawed incrementally in the way that frontier towns thaw reluctantly. 1 degree at a time with no guarantees. Pete came back from town on a Tuesday with snow in his mustache and news in his expression that he delivered the way he delivered most things without prelude. "Hartman was at the bank yesterday," he said, settling into his chair. "Had a long meeting with Edgar Morse. Came out looking satisfied." He looked at Caleb. "Morse holds the note on Dennison's farm and on the Briley property. And on the—" He stopped. "Let the implications settle." Caleb set down his coffee cup very carefully. "He doesn't hold anything of mine." "No," Pete said. "But he holds things belonging to men who do business with you. Men who buy your cattle. Men who use your equipment come spring. Men—" He stopped again. "He's going to squeeze them," Caleb said. "He's going to squeeze them," Pete confirmed. "And they're going to have to choose between their mortgages and their association with you. That's the calculation he's making." The kitchen went very quiet. Adeline had been at the far end of the table, writing her letter to Thomas. She had gone still when Pete started talking and had not moved since. She was looking at the letter in front of her, but she was not seeing it. "This is because of me," she said. "This is because of Hartman," Caleb said immediately. "Don't, Adeline." His voice was not sharp, but it was firm. "A man who uses financial leverage to punish people for refusing to participate in his cruelty is not acting because of you." He's acting because of what he is. There's a difference. The difference doesn't change what happens to your neighbors, she said. She pushed back from the table and stood. She was not crying. She looked like a woman holding something very heavy and deciding. Deliberately, I'll go to town. No, Caleb said. I can find work. Mrs. Finch might need help at the hotel. Or the seamstress. No, Caleb said again. He stood up. He was considerably taller than her, but he did not use that difference in any aggressive way. He simply stood, level and still, and looked at her. Running doesn't solve this. It tells Hartman that the pressure worked, and then he applies it somewhere else. To someone else, the next time someone fails to meet his expectations. He held her gaze. I'm not going to let him do that. Caleb, I am not worth your. I'd like you to stop telling me what you're worth, he said. And something in his voice made her stop talking. Not anger. Something quieter and more serious than anger. I've made my own assessments. They don't match his. She stared at him. Pete cleared his throat. There's one more thing, he said from his chair. They both looked at him. He was looking at the fire. Hartman's been talking to Sheriff Greer. The silence that followed that sentence was a different quality entirely. About what? Caleb said. About the legality of the original arrangement, Pete said. The mail order agreement. He's claiming she abandoned the contract. Claiming she owes him the cost of the travel arrangement he paid for. He paused. Greer's a reasonable man mostly, but he and Hartman go back 20 years. And Hartman's been generous to the sheriff's department at budget time. He looked at Caleb. I'm just telling you what I know. Adeline sat back down. Slowly, she set her hands flat on the table. She was looking at nothing and processing everything. And Caleb watched her face move through a rapid private sequence, fear first. Quickly managed. Then fury, briefly present. Then the calculating intelligence that he had come to recognize as her particular kind of strength. Moving in to replace the emotion with strategy. He paid for my train ticket, she said. Her voice was precise, controlled. $42 from Cincinnati to Harrow Creek. I have the receipt. She looked at Caleb. I have $20 from the envelope he threw at my feet. I have $12 of my own. She did the math silently. I can get 30 more from. She stopped. Pause. From nothing. I have nothing else. You don't owe him the ticket, Caleb said. The law might say differently. The law would have to prove the original contract was valid, and that you abandoned it voluntarily, Caleb said. You didn't abandon it. He terminated it publicly in front of witnesses. There's a difference, and any judge who isn't Hartman's personal investment would see that difference immediately. And if the judge is Hartman's personal investment, Caleb didn't answer that immediately. Because it was a real question, and it deserved a real answer, and he didn't have one yet. It was Pete who spoke. There's a lawyer in Billings, he said. Name of Horace Webb. He's not cheap, but he's honest. Which is rarer and more valuable. If this goes somewhere official, Webb's the man to talk to. I can't pay a lawyer, Adeline said. I can, Caleb said. She turned and looked at him sharply. I'm not offering charity, he said, before she could speak. I'm offering a practical solution to a problem that exists because a man with too much money and too little character is trying to hurt someone I've decided to protect. That's not charity, that's a position. He met her eyes. I take positions, I tend to hold them. She was very still. Why, she said. The word was quiet and genuine and had nothing performative in it. Caleb, honestly, you don't know me, you owe me nothing. Every single day I'm here, the cost to you goes up. So why? He thought about it. He was a man who thought before he spoke. And she had come to understand that the pauses were not evasion, they were precision. He was finding the right words, not hiding from the question. Because the first night, he said, when you sat across this table from me, you said something. You said your mother believed that cooking for people was a form of love. He looked at his cup. And then you cooked for me. Before, you knew me. Before you had any reason to. He looked up. A woman who gives what little she has to someone who hasn't earned it yet isn't someone I walk away from. That's all. The fire crackled. Pete was studying the ceiling with the intense concentration of a man who is politely not listening. Adeline looked at Caleb for a long time. Her eyes were bright not with tears. Exactly, but with the brightness that comes right before tears that a person is not going to allow. All right, she said quietly. All right. It was the second time she had said those words to him. And they meant something different this time, fuller and more committed. Like a door not just opened but walked through. What happened next came sooner than any of them expected. 4 days later, on a Thursday morning that came in bright and cold and deceptively ordinary. Caleb was in the barn when he heard the horses. He heard them before he saw anything the particular rhythm of multiple riders moving with purpose. Not casually, the sound of men who have a destination and a reason. He came out of the barn and saw them coming up the road. Sheriff Roy Greer on his bay horse, 2 deputies flanking him. And behind them, on a coal-black gelding that cost more than most men in Harrow Creek made in a year. Wesley Hartman. Hartman was dressed for an audience. That was the first thing Caleb noticed: the good coat, the brushed hat, the upright posture of a man who has rehearsed his entrance. He looked like a man coming to collect what was owed to him, which was exactly what he believed he was doing. Caleb stood in front of the barn and waited. Greer pulled up first. He was a big man, mid-50, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something almost unreadable over years of making decisions he didn't always like. He looked, noted that. "Morning." "Caleb," Greer said. "Sheriff," Caleb said. "I've got a complaint filed," Greer said. He said it like a man reciting something he wishes he didn't have to recite. From Wesley Hartman. Regarding a woman named Adeline Mercer. Currently on your property. The complaint alleges breach of contract, and he paused. And the pause had something apologetic in it: unlawful detainment. The word landed like a slap. "Unlawful detainment," Caleb repeated very quietly. "Now I want to be clear," Greer started. "She is here of her own free will," Caleb said. "She has been here of her own free will from the first moment she set foot on this property. She is not detained. She is employed. She has her own room with a bolt on the inside of the door that she uses of her own choosing." His voice was flat and steady and had no heat in it, which somehow made it more dangerous than heat would have. If that complaint alleges otherwise, the complaint is a lie. And whoever filed it knows it's a lie. Hartman rode forward slightly. He had said nothing yet. He was watching Caleb with the expression of a man who is used to other men stepping back from him and is waiting for it to happen. "I'll talk to the woman," Hartman said, directly. "She can speak for herself and tell the sheriff whether she's staying here willingly or whether she's been—" "She can do that," Caleb said. "But she does it outside and in the open, not taken into a room with you and 2 deputies. Those are my terms for this conversation." "Your terms," Hartman said. And smiled the kind of smile that is not warm. "My property," Caleb said. "My terms." The front door of the cabin opened. Adeline stepped out. She had not been told anyone was coming. She had heard the horses, and she had come out on her own. And she was standing on the front step in her green coat, the same one she'd worn off the train, with her hands clasped in front of her, and her chin at exactly the angle it had been on the platform. That 1/4-inch lift that was not defiance and not defeat, but something more durable than either. She looked at Hartman. He looked at her, and for a moment nobody said anything. "Miss Mercer," Sheriff Greer said carefully, "Mr. Hartman has filed a complaint. I need to ask you directly, are you on this property of your own will?" "Yes," she said. Immediately, no hesitation. "Has anyone prevented you from leaving?" "Or no," she said. "Mr. Whitaker offered me shelter during a storm and employment afterward. I accepted both. I am here because I choose to be here." Greer nodded. He looked slightly relieved. Hartman moved his horse forward another step. "Adeline." His voice shifted lower, more personal. The voice of a man changing tactics. "I want you to understand that I acted in haste. The circumstances of that day, the train was late. I was under pressure with the ranch. I may have spoken more harshly than the situation warranted. The yard was very still. Adeline looked at him. I'm prepared to honor the original arrangement, Hartman said. You would have a home, security, everything I originally promised. He spread his hands, a gesture of openness. Generosity, magnanimity. Rehearsed, Caleb thought. Every bit of it rehearsed. I think in the end this is what's best for you. Adeline was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. You dropped my trunk off a platform, she said, in front of 30 people. You threw money at my feet. You called me plain and told me I was not what you paid for. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. And now you've come to my employer's property with a sheriff and 2 deputies to file a false complaint that uses the word detainment because you are angry that I didn't disappear the way you expected me to. She looked at him with the steady, clear attention of a woman who has nothing left to lose and has discovered, to her own surprise, that this is a form of freedom. I don't want your home, Mr. Hartman. I don't want your security. I don't want anything you have. A pause. What I want is for you to leave this property. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Caleb had heard in years. One of the deputies looked at the ground. The other cleared his throat. Greer looked at Hartman with an expression that had shifted. Incrementally, from uncomfortable to something closer to reluctant respect for her. Caleb thought not for Hartman. Hartman's face had changed. The rehearsed magnanimity was gone. What was underneath it was something older and colder, the expression of a man who has been refused something in public and cannot process it. You're making a mistake, he said. The warmth was entirely gone now. I've made mistakes, Adeline said. Answering your advertisement was one of them. This is a correction. Hartman looked at Caleb. The look was long and deliberate. The kind that is meant to communicate something, a promise. Or a warning, or both. Caleb met it without expression and waited for him to finish. This isn't over, Hartman said. It is for today, Caleb said. I'll ask you to move off my property now, Sheriff. He looked at Greer. I trust the complaint will be reviewed in light of Miss Mercer's statement. It will be, Greer said. He was already turning his horse. He looked, Caleb thought, like a man who had come expecting one kind of mourning and received a considerably different kind, and was privately glad of the difference. Come on. Wesley. Hartman held his position for one moment longer, the last performance of a man who needed to believe he had chosen to leave rather than been told to. Then he turned the black gelding and rode out, and his deputies followed. And the sheriff brought up the rear, and the sound of hooves faded down the road and was swallowed by the silence of the Montana morning. Caleb and Adeline stood in the yard. Pete appeared in the barn doorway behind Caleb, where he had apparently positioned himself at some point during the proceedings with a clear sightline and a very casual posture. That went well, Pete said. Pete, Caleb said. Go fix the north fence. Going, Pete said. And retreated into the barn with the dignity of a man who has said his piece. Caleb looked at Adeline. She was still standing on the front step. She was looking at the road where Hartman had gone, and her hands, he noticed, were not quite as steady as they'd been during the confrontation. They were shaking slightly, the fine controlled trembling of a person whose body has realized, after the fact, what the mind was doing. Adeline, he said. She turned and looked at him, and the careful composure was still there, but it was thinner now. Translucent, and underneath it he could see all the things she was carrying, the exhaustion. The fear, the fierce and private satisfaction of having said what she'd said and meant every word of it. And the knowledge that none of it was actually finished. He's going to come back, she said. It was not a question. Probably, Caleb said, but not today. He moved toward the cabin door and held it open. Come inside. I'll make the coffee for once. She looked at him. I know how to make coffee, he said. I've tasted your coffee, she said. Once. That was an off morning. It tasted like something you'd strip paint with. Then I'll try harder today, he said. She looked at him for another moment, and then she did something he had not expected. She laughed. Short, surprised, genuine. The laugh of a person who has just gone through something enormous and has found, on the other side of it, the absurdity of paint-stripping coffee, waiting there patiently. She walked through the door he was holding. He followed her in. The days after that had a different texture. Something had crystallized between them on the front step, something in the watching of it. In Caleb seeing her stand her ground and Adeline knowing he was standing behind it with her. It didn't make things easier exactly. Hartman's influence in town continued to make itself felt in small, steady ways. A cattle buyer who had been reliable sent word that he was looking at other suppliers. A neighbor who usually helped with fence repair sent his apologies that he was too busy this season. The Reverend wrote another letter that also went into the fire. But inside the cabin, something was growing that had nothing to do with storms or sheriffs or men on coal-black horses. It grew in the mornings when Caleb came in from the barn to find coffee that was demonstrably better than his, and Adeline already at the table with a book or a letter. And the easy way they had of sharing a space without performing anything for each other. It grew in the evenings by the fire when she read aloud, sometimes Dickens mostly, but once a long passage from a history of the Western Territories that she had found on his shelf and been unable to stop reading, and her voice in the quiet cabin was something he had not known he was missing until it was there. It grew in the small collisions of daily life. The afternoon, she was reaching for something on the high shelf, and he reached past her to get it, and they were briefly closer than the space required. Both of them aware of it, both of them stepping back with a different kind of care than before. He noticed things he had no particular business noticing. The way she tilted her head when she was thinking. The particular economy of her movements when she was focused on a task. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive. The way she laughed rarely. And therefore when it came it was real, always real. Nothing manufactured for social comfort. He said nothing about any of it. He was a man who had spent 12 years building something alone on the Montana frontier. And caution had become a reflex. You tested the ice before you put your weight on it. You didn't assume the well would last through summer. You didn't say the things out loud that once said could not be unsaid and would need to be dealt with one way or another. But some things do not wait for the right moment. It was a Wednesday evening, 2.5 weeks after Hartman's visit to the property. Pete was in town. The fire was burning low and comfortable. Adeline was mending again. She had worked through his pile of neglected clothing and had somehow found more to do, which he had not asked her to do but had not objected to, and Caleb was at the table with a ledger, working through numbers that were not as bad as he'd feared, but were not as good as he'd hoped. "I got a letter today," she said. He looked up. She said it quietly, looking at the mending in her hands, and her voice had something in it that was difficult to read relief. Definitely, and something more complicated underneath it. "He's in Nevada still. He's working in a mine outside Carson City. He sounds well. He sounds like Thomas." A pause. "He wants me to come." The ledger was very still under Caleb's hands. "He says there's a boarding house near him, run by a woman named Mrs. Carver. He says it's decent and safe." Adeline was still looking at the mending. "He sent money for the train." The fire made a sound. The wind moved outside. "That's good news," Caleb said. His voice was steady, and he meant it. He did mean it. "He did. That's what you were hoping for." "Yes," she said. She was quiet. "It is." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "When?" he asked. He said, "As soon as I can manage it." She set down the mending. She looked at the fire rather than at him. "I haven't written back yet." A pause. I haven't been able to write back yet." "Why?" he asked. He asked it the same way he asked everything, directly. Without accusation, just wanting to know. She was quiet for a long time. "Because Carson City is very far from here," she said. And then she stopped, as if she had said more than she intended, and pressed her lips together and looked at the fire. Caleb closed the ledger. "Adeline," he said. She turned and looked at him, and her face was open in a way it very rarely was, the composure still there, but thinner than it had ever been, and underneath it something honest and uncertain and slightly frightened. The face of a woman standing at a decision she had not expected to be difficult. "I have a proposition," he said. She watched him. "I am not going to pretend that having you in this house has been anything other than—" He stopped. "Started differently. This ranch is too big for one man. Pete's leaving in the spring. I've known that for a month." He looked at her directly. "I'm also not going to pretend that what I'm about to say is purely about practical arrangements. Because I don't think it is, and I don't think you'd believe me if I said so." The fire was very quiet. "I am asking you," he said, "to stay. Not as an employee." As he stopped again, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked uncertain, genuinely uncertain, carefully feeling his way across unfamiliar ground. "I'm asking you to consider something more permanent. If you're willing. If the idea isn't—" He stopped a third time. "I'm not good at this," he said. "You're doing fine," she said. Her voice was very soft. "I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me," he said. "Legally. With the full understanding that I will not pressure you into anything you don't choose freely, and that if you would rather go to Nevada, I will drive you to the train station myself and make sure you get there safely." He held her gaze. "But I'd like it very much if you didn't." The room was completely still. Adeline looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He was good at waiting. He had always been good at waiting. And this was the most important thing he had waited for in his adult life. And he sat with it without flinching. "I answered an advertisement once," she said finally. "For a practical arrangement with a man I didn't know." Her voice was careful. "I know how that ended." "I know," he said. "This is different," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," he simply. Without elaboration, because some things don't need elaboration. They need only to be said clearly, and meant, and left for the other person to assess by their own measure. She looked at him. She looked at the room they were sitting in, the fire. The books, the small organized space that had become, without her planning it, more familiar than any place she had been since her mother's kitchen on Weston Street in Philadelphia 12 years ago. She looked at the man across the table who had walked toward her in the snow when everyone else walked away, and had not once in all the weeks since, given her cause to regret that she had climbed into his wagon. "Yes," she said. His breath came out slowly. "Yes," she said again. And this time there was nothing careful about it. It was simple and full and real. The word of a woman who had thought it through and meant it completely. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and she turned hers over and held it. And they sat like that for a while, with the fire burning down and the Montana night pressing its cold hands against the cabin walls, and the decision made and settled between them like something that had been waiting to be made for a very long time. Outside, the road that ran past the ranch was empty and dark and cold. But in the distance, in the town of Harrow Creek, Wesley Hartman had received news that afternoon from a man he paid to watch things he wanted watched. He sat with the news for a long time, and then he called for his horse. The news reached Caleb before breakfast. Pete came through the door at first light. Still in his riding coat, snow on his shoulders, and the expression on his face was the one he reserved for things that could not wait. Adeline was at the stove. Caleb was at the table with his coffee. They both looked up at the same moment. "Hartman filed papers yesterday afternoon," Pete said. He didn't sit down. "At the county courthouse in Billings." Not through Greer this time. He went over Greer's head entirely. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and set it on the table. "Injunction. He's claiming the mail order agreement constitutes a legal contract of property transfer, and that Adeline is in possession of goods and travel funds belonging to him. He's asking the court to compel her return to his custody pending a hearing." The word custody landed in the room like a thrown stone. Adeline turned from the stove. She did not speak. She looked at the paper on the table, and her face went through and something rapid and private, and then settled into the particular stillness that Caleb had come to understand was not calm but was what she wore over the top of things that were threatening to overwhelm her. Custody, she said. The word was flat, deliberate. That's what it says, Pete said. I am not property, she said. No, Pete said. You're not. But Hartman has a lawyer in Billings who apparently believes he can make an argument that the terms of the original limit, the agreement he terminated, Caleb said. His voice was very quiet. The agreement he's now claiming she terminated by abandoning the arranged meeting point. Pete looked at him steadily. He's rewritten the sequence of events. His version has her failing to appear at the agreed location. Him waiting, and her having left with you voluntarily before he had the opportunity to fulfill his obligations. Caleb stared at him. There were 30 people on that platform. There were 30 people on that platform, Pete agreed. And Hartman has been very busy in the 6 weeks since then, talking to those 30 people individually. He paused. 12 of them have signed statements supporting his version. The kitchen was absolutely silent. 12, Adeline said. 12, Pete said. He looked at her with the direct, uncushioned honesty that was his particular form of respect. Men who owe him money. Men whose land he's adjacent to. Men who need something from him come spring planting. He paused. And 3 who don't owe him anything, but are afraid of what happens if they say so publicly. Adeline set down the wooden spoon she was holding. She set it down carefully, deliberately, the way a person sets down something fragile when their hands are not entirely steady. She walked to the table and pulled out a chair and sat down. And she looked at the paper without touching it. He's been planning this, she said quietly. Not a question. Since the day we turned him off the property, Caleb said. He was looking at Pete. Webb, can we get Webb from Billings out here before the hearing date? Hearing's in 12 days, Pete said. Can we get him? I sent a wire from town this morning, Pete said. Before I rode out. Webb's expecting your response by end of day. Caleb nodded once. He stood up. He went to his coat by the door and took out his billfold. He counted what was there, looked at it for a moment. Put it back. Tell Webb yes, he said. Whatever he charges. Caleb, Adeline started. Adeline, you can't me, he said. Simply, without drama, he sat back down and picked up his coffee cup and looked at her across the table. This is not a discussion. We tell him everything. We find the witnesses who told the truth and we make sure they're heard. He paused. We're not going to lose this. She looked at him for a long moment. You don't know that. No, he said, I don't. But I know I'm not going to let you face it without every resource I have. He set down his cup. That's what I know. Pete cleared his throat. There's one more thing. Both of them looked at him. He reached into his coat again and produced a second piece of paper. He set it beside the first one. This came with the injunction papers. Served separately. He looked at Caleb. He's filed a complaint with the Territorial Land Office, claiming your north fence line encroaches on his grazing rights by 60 feet. Caleb went very still. That fence has been in the same place for 9 years, he said. I know that, Pete said. Hartman's land doesn't come within a quarter mile of my north line. I know that too, Pete said. But a land dispute that goes to formal survey ties up your operation for months. Potentially through spring. Potentially through summer. He looked at him. He's not trying to win the land claim. He's trying to keep you occupied. Financially stretched and distracted while the court case proceeds. Caleb sat with that for a moment. Adeline watched his face. She had learned to read him in the weeks they'd been sharing a table and a roof and a set of daily rhythms. And what she saw now was not fear and not defeat, but something harder and colder, a man calculating. Precisely and without sentiment, the full shape of what he was dealing with. He's not just angry, Caleb said finally. He's thorough. He's had money long enough to know how to use it as a weapon, Pete said. Yes. Caleb looked at Adeline. She was already looking at him. I need you to do something, he said. Name it, she said. I need you to write down everything you remember, he said. Every detail, the train car, what you were wearing. What he said word for word, in the order he said it. The names of anyone you spoke to on that platform. Even briefly, the man at the luggage cart, the woman at the station door. He paused. Everything. I remember everything, she said quietly. I know you do, he said. I need it on paper. She nodded. She pulled the paper toward her, not the legal documents, but a clean sheet from the stack on the shelf, and she picked up a pencil, and she began to write. Caleb watched her for one moment. Then he looked at Pete. Get word to Roy Greer, he said. Not about the injunction, about the witnesses. Ask him, man to man, whether he saw what he saw on that platform. Whether 12 people signed statements change what his own eyes told him that day. He paused. Greer's not corrupt. He's pressured. Those are different things. Pete nodded. And if he's pressured past the point of honest, then we find out now, Caleb said. Better now than in a courtroom. Webb arrived on the 9th day. 3 days before the hearing, on a morning that came in gray and purposeful. He was a compact man in his early 50s, dark-suited, with quick eyes that moved over everything in a room before he'd fully entered it, and a handshake that was brief and firm and wasted nothing. He sat at Caleb's kitchen table with a cup of coffee he didn't touch and a leather case he opened immediately, and he listened. He listened to everything. He let Adeline speak first. And he listened to her the way very good lawyers listen, not for confirmation of what he already believed, but for the specific detail that changes the shape of an argument. He interrupted twice, both times to ask for clarification on a precise point. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment. The envelope, he said. The one he threw at your feet. You kept it. Yes, Adeline said. You have it now? She went to her room and came back with it, the white envelope. Slightly worn at the corners, the $20 still inside, because she had not spent any of it. Some instinct telling her it was evidence rather than funds. Webb took it carefully. He looked at the outside. He looked at the inside. He set it in front of him on the table. His fingerprints are on this, he said. Figuratively speaking, the act of throwing it witnessed. You said, by how many people approximately? Everyone on the platform, Adeline said. 30, perhaps more. And the trunk, Webb said. He physically removed your trunk from the platform himself. Yes, describe that again. Specifically. She described it, Webb wrote. His pen moved quickly and his face showed nothing. Which Caleb had decided within the first 10 minutes of meeting him was a good sign. A lawyer who showed you what he was thinking while you talked was a lawyer managing his own reaction rather than absorbing yours. All right, Webb said when she finished. He set down his pen. He looked at Caleb. Here's what he has. He has 12 signed statements claiming Adeline failed to appear at a designated meeting point. He has a lawyer named Cartwright who is not stupid and who will argue that the original agreement was breached by her abandonment. He has a judge in Billings named Harold Fenn who's ruled in Hartman's favor before on a water rights case and who may or may not be sympathetic. He folded his hands. Here's what we have. We have the original letters, which I've read, and which contain specific language about the obligations of both parties that works heavily in our favor. We have the envelope, which physically demonstrates that he made a settlement offer, which means he knew he was terminating the agreement. Not her. We have the trunk, which is the act of a man ending something. Not a man waiting for someone. He paused. And we have Sheriff Roy Greer. Caleb looked up. Greer came to my office in Billings 2 days ago, Webb said. Voluntarily, he gave me a signed statement. He reached into his leather case and set a single folded paper on the table. His account of what he witnessed on that platform is, Webb allowed himself the smallest expression. Something that on a less controlled face would have been satisfaction comprehensive. Adeline picked up the statement and read it. Caleb watched her face as she read. He watched something shift in it, the tight, careful management loosening slightly, the first real easing he had seen in 9 days. She set it down. She looked at Webb. He told the truth, she said. He told the truth, Webb said. All of it. Including the part where he notes that Hartman's 12 witnesses were all contacted by Hartman's ranch foreman in the 3 days following the incident, before any formal complaint was filed. He picked up his coffee cup for the first time and took a sip. That's called witness coordination, and it is significantly less impressive when a jury understands what it is. There's a jury? Caleb asked. Hartman's lawyer filed for a civil hearing before a judge, Webb said. No jury, which I believe was intentional. Cartwright knows a jury of regular people would look at what happened on that platform and reach a verdict in about 4 minutes. His eyes moved between them. But Judge Fenn is a man of the law first. He follows precedent. And the precedent in territorial contract cases is very clear. A party who takes physical action to terminate an arrangement returning property, making a settlement offer, physically removing shared goods, has demonstrated termination regardless of what they claim afterward. He closed his leather case. We're going to be all right. He said it without flourish, without reassurance for its own sake, the way a man says something because it is accurate. And because of that, because it came from a man who had shown in 40 minutes of conversation that he chose his words with extreme care, it landed differently than reassurance would have. Adeline exhaled. It was a small sound, barely there. But Caleb heard it, and Pete heard it, and Webb pretended not to notice it in the particular professional courtesy of a man who understood that some moments belonged to the people in them. The hearing was in Billings, which meant a 2-day ride. Caleb and Adeline left the morning before, with Pete staying to manage the ranch. The ride was long and cold, and they rode side by side for most of it, which meant they talked, and talking on horseback for hours in cold air is different from talking at a kitchen table by firelight. There is something about the forward motion, about the shared direction, that loosens things a person might otherwise hold more carefully. She told him about Thomas, about the specific quality of her brother's laugh, which she had apparently been holding in her memory so carefully it had not faded at all in 2 years of silence. She told him about a summer when she was 9, when her father had been successful enough to take the family to the Jersey Shore for 3 weeks, and the particular color of the water there, and how she had tried to describe it to herself many times since and never quite gotten it right. She told him small things, the kind of things a person tells when they are not performing conversation, but are simply offering what is true. He told her about the ranch, about the first winter, when he had been 24 and alone, and the snow had come in so deep and so fast that he'd been cut off for 6 weeks, with half the provisions he'd calculated for. About the horse he'd lost that winter, a bay mare named Clara, who had been with him since he was 19, and the particular kind of grief that the death of an animal creates. Different from the grief for a person, quieter, and in some ways harder to talk about. He told her about his brother in Ohio, who wrote letters every Christmas and every Easter, and whom he had not seen in 7 years. He told her about the first summer he'd turned a profit on the cattle and stood in the field at dusk and felt something he hadn't known how to name then, and still didn't entirely. Something that was satisfaction, but was also lonelier than satisfaction was supposed to be. She listened the way she did everything completely, without partial attention, turned slightly toward him even on horseback, so that he understood she was receiving what he said. "You built something real," she said, when he'd finished talking about that first profitable summer. "I built something," he said. "Whether it becomes real depends on whether it lasts." "What would make it last?" she asked. He looked at the road ahead. "The right things in it," he said. The right, he paused. The right person to build it with. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I would like to learn to ride properly. If we're going to be doing this regularly." He looked at her sideways. "I can't ride," she said. "I ride adequately. I would like to ride well." "There's a difference." "There's always a difference," she said. "Between adequate and well. I prefer well. I've noticed," he said. And he was smiling, a real one, the kind that came without planning. They arrived in Billings that evening and stayed at separate lodgings. Webb's arrangement, because the hearing was the next morning, and Webb was a man who left nothing to the opposition that could be avoided. The courthouse in Billings was a two-story brick building that smelled of wood polish and old paper, and the particular quality of rooms where consequential things happened regularly. They arrived early. Webb was already there. Cartwright, Hartman's lawyer, was a tall man with silver at his temples and the smooth, measured movements of someone who had been in many courtrooms and had won in most of them. He nodded at Webb with the professional courtesy of opposing counsel and looked at Adeline with the brief, assessing glance of a man categorizing a witness. Hartman arrived 5 minutes before the hearing began. He came through the courthouse doors with 2 men behind him and the particular quality of forward motion that beats long who have decided the outcome in advance. He saw Caleb first. He looked at him for a long moment with the cold promise of a man who does not forget. Then he looked at Adeline. Something passed through his expression. Not guilt. Caleb did not believe Hartman was capable of guilt in any form that would register on his face. But something. Recalculation, maybe. The slight adjustment of a man who has looked at his opponent and found something he did not plan for. Adeline looked back at him. She did not look away. She held his gaze with the steady, clear attention of a woman who had already decided that he would never again make her look at the ground. And after a moment it was Hartman who turned away. Judge Harold Fenn was a narrow man in his 60s with a formal bearing and reading spectacles he wore, pushed down on his nose so that he looked at everything over them, which gave him the permanent air of mild skepticism. He called the hearing to order at 9 o'clock precisely, and Cartwright opened with a version of events that was polished, logical, and almost entirely fictional. Adeline sat beside Webb and listened to Cartwright describe a woman who had failed to appear at a designated point, who had accepted accommodation from a strange man without informing her contracted partner, who had resisted all attempts at reconciliation. She listened to 12 signed statements read into the record in voices that made them sound like truth. She listened to Cartwright argue that the mail order agreement was a binding legal instrument and that the $20 in the envelope constituted not a termination settlement, but a good faith advance that she had taken under false pretenses. She listened to all of it, with her hands flat on the table in front of her, and her face composed, and her breathing measured. And she did not react, because Webb had told her not to react. And she had understood immediately why every reaction would be noted. And Cartwright was good enough to use any of them. Then Webb stood up. He began with the letters. He read sections aloud, Hartman's own words, in his own handwriting, describing obligations he had undertaken and the specific conditions under which the arrangement would be considered fulfilled. He read the clause about the meeting location, and he read the clause about the timeline, and he read, very slowly and very clearly, the paragraph in which Hartman had written that he considered himself bound by the agreement from the moment Adeline purchased her train ticket. Then he put the letters down, and he picked up the envelope. Your Honor, he said, a man who wishes to hold a woman to a contract does not throw money at her feet in public and tell her to sort herself out. He set the envelope on the judge's bench. A man who intends to fulfill an agreement does not physically remove a woman's luggage from a platform in front of 30 witnesses. These are not the actions of a man waiting for his contracted partner. These are the actions of a man who has decided the arrangement is over and wishes to be free of its obligations without accepting the legal consequences of that decision. He paused. Sheriff Roy Greer witnessed these actions. His statement is in the record. The envelope is physical evidence, and the 12 signed statements submitted by opposing counsel were, as the record shows, coordinated by Mr. Hartman's own ranch foreman in the days immediately following the incident, a fact that raises significant questions about their independence. Judge Fenn looked at the envelope over his spectacles. He looked at the letters. He looked at Greer's statement, which he had been reading while Webb spoke, and his expression did not change because his expression never changed. But something in his posture did a slight forward lean. The posture of a man who has found the thing in a case that matters. Cartwright objected twice. Webb responded to both objections with the calm, slightly weary precision of a man who anticipated them. Then Adeline testified. Webb had prepared her. But preparation only takes a person so far. The rest is the person themselves, standing in a room where the truth matters and choosing to give it. She answered every question directly. She gave dates, times, specific words in the order they were spoken. When Cartwright cross-examined her, trying to find the edge of her composure, trying to suggest she had acted with calculation, she answered him with the same directness she brought to everything, not defensively, not emotionally, but with the flat, clear certainty of a woman reporting what happened, because it happened and the facts were not complicated. At one point, Cartwright asked her whether she had, in fact, spent any of the $20 from Hartman's envelope. No, she said, and why not? She looked at him steadily. Because it didn't belong to me, she said. He threw it away. That doesn't make it mine. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Fenn looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment. Cartwright moved on. The hearing lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Fenn called a recess of 30 minutes, and then returned and read his ruling in the flat, procedural tone of a man delivering a legal document rather than a performance. He found that the mail order agreement had been terminated by Hartman's own actions on the platform, as evidenced by the physical removal of goods, the public settlement offer, and the statement of Sheriff Greer. He found that the 12 witness statements, given the documented coordination by Hartman's foreman, could not be given full evidentiary weight. He found that Adeline Mercer owed Wesley Hartman nothing, not the cost of the train ticket, not the $20, not any further obligation under any interpretation of the original agreement. He dismissed the injunction entirely. He noted, in language that was legally precise and therefore more devastating than any editorial comment would have been, that the filing of a custody claim against an adult woman on the basis of a mail order agreement was without legal precedent and bordered on the frivolous. Hartman sat very still through all of it. His face showed nothing. He was too practiced at control to show what he felt in a public room. But his hands on the table in front of him were flat and pressed hard against the surface. The hands of a man containing something by force. When Fenn left the bench, Cartwright leaned close to Hartman and said something quietly. Hartman did not respond. He stood up, he buttoned his coat. He looked across the room at Caleb, and the look was long and deliberate and had nothing uncertain in it. Caleb met it without moving. Hartman looked at Adeline. She looked back at him, and what was in her face was not triumph. She was not a woman who performed triumph, but something quieter and more complete. The expression of a person who has stood in a place where they were told they had no right to stand, and has been told by a higher authority than the man who moved them that they were right to stand there. Hartman turned and walked out of the courtroom without speaking to anyone. Webb was already putting papers back into his leather case. He snapped it closed. He looked at Caleb. Land claim will collapse on its own, he said. Without the legal leverage of the main case, there's no strategic value in pursuing it. He'll withdraw within the month. He looked at Adeline. You did well in there. I told the truth, she said. In my experience, Webb said dryly, that is considerably harder than it sounds, and a great deal rarer than it should be. He shook both their hands and left. Caleb and Adeline stood in the emptying courtroom, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then she turned to him and he saw, for the first time since he had known her, that she was not holding herself together. She was not performing composure. The careful architecture of control that she had maintained for weeks through the injunction papers and the 12 false statements and the long ride and the 4-hour hearing had come down. Not dramatically, not in pieces, but all at once and quietly. The way a thing comes down when it no longer needs to be held up. She was crying, not loudly, not with any kind of performance. Just tears, moving down her face in the particular way of someone who has been strong for a very long time and has finally reached the place where it is safe not to be. He stepped toward her, and she leaned into him, and he put his arms around her with the careful, steady certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is and exactly where he wants to be. And he held her while she cried, and said nothing. Because there was nothing that needed saying. Outside the courthouse, the town of Billings moved around them in its ordinary daily business, indifferent to everything that had just happened in that room. But 4 miles away, on a road he had ridden down 100 times, Pete Garner was mending a fence in the cold Montana air and looking up at the sky with the practiced eye of a man who had lived in this territory long enough to read it. And what he saw there made him frown, not weather. Not another storm. He had seen 2 riders on the far ridge an hour ago. He had thought nothing of it at the time, but they had not moved on. They were still there, watching the ranch. Pete didn't say anything to anyone about the riders on the ridge that day. He told himself it was because there was nothing definitive to say. 2 men on a ridge in Montana was not a crime. It was not even unusual. Men rode ridges. Men stopped on high ground to check their bearings, or rest their horses, or look at the sky. He told himself all of that, and he went back to mending the fence. And he kept his eyes moving the way 40 years of frontier life had trained him to keep his eyes moving. And when he looked up an hour later, the riders were gone. But the feeling they left behind was not gone. It sat in the back of his chest like a splinter small. Specific, impossible to ignore once you were aware of it. Caleb and Adeline rode back from Billings the next morning. Pete met them in the yard before they dismounted. And Caleb took one look at the old man's face and said, "What happened?" "Nothing happened," Pete said. "That's what's bothering me." He told them about the riders. He described their position the north ridge, above the fence line, with a clear sight line to the main buildings. He described how long they'd stayed. He described the way they'd gone when they went not down the far side of the ridge away from the ranch, but back along the ridgetop toward the eastern pass, which was the long way around to anywhere but the direct way to Hartman's north property line. Caleb listened without interrupting. Adeline stood beside him and listened too. And when Pete finished, she said, "He sent them to count what we have." Both men looked at her. "That's what you do before you take something," she said. Her voice was steady and factual. "You look at it first. You learn the shape of it." She looked at Caleb. He lost in court. He lost publicly. A man like Hartman doesn't absorb that and move on. He recalculates. She paused. What does he want that he can't get through lawyers? The 3 of them stood in the cold yard, and the question settled over them like the temperature dropping. "The cattle," Pete said slowly. "Spring drive is 6 weeks out. If something happened to the herd before the drive." "He wouldn't," Caleb said. Then he stopped. He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment Adeline watched him do what she had seen him do before, set aside what he wanted to be true, and look honestly at what was likely. "He would," he said. "Not directly," Pete said, "not himself. But he's got men who do things and don't ask what they're for." "The Doyle brothers," Caleb said. Pete nodded. "They've worked for Hartman 3 seasons. No fixed wage." He looked at the barn. A herd spooked into the wrong canyon in the dark doesn't come back. Nobody can prove it wasn't an accident. Adeline was very still. "How many cattle?" 83 head, Caleb said. "The spring drive is the operating income for the whole year." Without it, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "We move them tonight," Adeline said. Both men looked at her. "Move them," she said again, and her voice had the same quality it had carried in the courtroom, not loud. Not aggressive, but with a certainty underneath it that did not leave room for negotiation. "Don't leave them where men on a ridge have already counted them. Move them somewhere Hartman's men don't know about and don't expect." She looked at Pete. "Is there somewhere?" Pete thought for a moment. "Brennan's South Pasture," he said slowly. "Tom Brennan owes Caleb a debt from 2 winters ago. He won't ask questions and he won't talk." He paused. "It's 8 miles, but it's solid ground and the fencing's good." "Then we move them tonight," Adeline said. She looked at Caleb. Unless you have a reason not to. He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had walked into his life in a green coat with a broken trunk and nowhere to go, and who was now standing in his yard, telling him how to protect what he'd built. He felt something move through him that he did not examine closely, because this was not the moment for it. Pete, he said, saddle up. They moved the herd that night. In the dark, in the cold, in near silence. It was hard work and slow work, and the kind of work that tests a person's actual usefulness rather than their theoretical capabilities. Adeline rode with them. She had said she would, and Caleb had not argued. Partly because he'd seen her on horseback and knew she was more capable than adequate despite her own self-assessment, and partly because he had understood by now that arguing with Adeline about what she was going to do was a project that required more time than the situation allowed. She rode flank on the east side for 6 miles, keeping the nervous animals from breaking right toward the tree line. And she did it without complaint and without drama. And when they finally got the herd into Brennan's south pasture at 2 in the morning and closed the gate, she sat on her horse in the dark and said nothing for a long moment. Good cattle, she said finally. Best I've had, Caleb said. We should tell Tom Brennan not to answer questions about the pasture count, she said. Already planning on it, Pete said. They rode back in the cold dark, and by the time they reached the ranch, the eastern sky was starting to lighten at its very edge. And all 3 of them were exhausted in the particular way of people who have done something necessary that could not wait. Adeline went inside. Caleb was unsaddling his horse in the barn when Pete appeared behind him and said, Quietly, you know this isn't over. I know, Caleb said. He's going to try something else, Pete said. The cattle were one option. When he finds them gone, he'll know we anticipated him. That makes him angrier and it makes him less predictable. Caleb finished with the saddle. He stood with his hands on the stall door. What would you do? He asked. He asked it seriously, the way he asked Pete, everything he genuinely wanted to know without any pretense that the older man's experience was less valuable than his own conviction. Pete thought about it honestly. I'd go to town, he said. Not to confront him, to talk, to the men who've been pressured. To the ones who signed the statements because they were afraid. He paused. Fear works as long as the thing being feared stays larger than the alternative. But you won the court case. Greer told the truth publicly. The judge dismissed the injunction and called it frivolous. He looked at Caleb. Hartman's armor has cracks in it now. People can see through cracks. If you give them something to see, they might stop being afraid, Caleb said. Some of them, Pete said. But some. Caleb nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. I'll go tomorrow. Take her with you, Pete said. Caleb looked at him. Take Adeline, Pete said. Let them see her. Not as a problem or a scandal or whatever story Hartman's been telling. Let them see who she actually is. He paused. People believe what they've seen more than what they've been told. Give them something to see. It was the longest strategic speech Pete had delivered in 6 years of working together. Caleb received it the way he received everything, Pete said, with the full respect of a man who understood that wisdom did not announce itself by volume. All right, he said. He told Adeline in the morning. Over coffee, sitting across the kitchen table in the pale early light of a day that was already 3 hours old for both of them. He told her what Pete had said and what he was planning to do and why. She listened. She held her cup with both hands and looked at the table while he talked. And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You want to take me into town, she said. As evidence, he considered that framing. As a person, he said. Which is the same thing in this case. The story Hartman's been telling requires you to be invisible or ruined or both. You being neither is the counter-argument. She looked up at him. And if it makes things worse, if the people who signed the statements feel cornered and push back harder, then we know where we stand, he said. Sooner rather than later. She thought about it. He waited. All right, she said, but I'm not going in there as a victim who needs her character defended. She set down her cup. If we go normally. We do business, we buy what we need. We speak to people the way we'd speak to them if none of this had happened. She looked at him. No performing. No asking for anyone's sympathy. Just being present and being ordinary and letting them draw their own conclusions. That's exactly what Pete said, Caleb told her. Pete is a very intelligent man, she said. Don't tell him that, Caleb said. He'll become insufferable. She smiled real and quick. The kind she still produced less often than he would have liked, but more often than when she'd first arrived. Which he had decided was one of the better measures of progress he had available to him. They rode into Harrow Creek the next morning. The first person they encountered was Marcus Dunmore, behind the counter of the general store, who looked up when they came in and had a moment brief. Visible, the flicker of a man deciding what he was going to do before he said, "Morning, Caleb," and then, after a pause that was one beat too long, "Morning, miss." "Good morning, Mr. Dunmore," Adeline said, and walked directly to the shelves and began reading labels with the focused attention of a woman shopping. Which she was. Caleb watched Dunmore watch her, watch the old man's expression move through something private and arrive somewhere slightly different than where it had started. Dunmore had been in Harrow Creek for 30 years. He had seen men like Hartman come and go, or rather, had seen men like Hartman not come and go, had seen them entrench and persist and make themselves permanently comfortable. He had always been careful around them. It was the carefulness of a man with a family and a business and a mortgage. And Caleb had never blamed him for it. But something was shifting in Marcus Dunmore's face this morning. And Caleb noticed it and said nothing. They were at the counter when Edgar Morse came in. Edgar Morse was the banker. He was the man Pete had mentioned in connection with Hartman, the man who held notes on half the struggling operations in the county, and whose relationship with Hartman was one of mutual profitable convenience. He was a thin, precise man who wore a suit every day regardless of weather and carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who believed that appearance was 9/10 of authority. He stopped when he saw them. He looked at Adeline. He looked at Caleb. His expression settled into something that was not quite hostility and not quite its absence. "Caleb," he said. Caleb said. A pause. Morse looked at Adeline again, not with the assessing cruelty of Hartman's look, but with a different kind of calculation. The banker's look. The look of a man reading a situation for its financial implications. "I heard about the Billings ruling," Morse said. He said it to Caleb, which was the coward's approach, but he said it, which was more than he'd said in 6 weeks. "Good ruling," Caleb said. "Is a fair man." Another pause. "Wesley's taking it hard," Morse said. "That's between Wesley and his own conduct," Caleb said. "Isn't it?" It was not quite a question. Morse heard the edge in it, the specific edge that says, "I know exactly what role you've been playing, and I'm giving you the opportunity to choose differently." He heard it, and he was silent for a moment, and then he looked at Adeline directly for the first time. "Miss Mercer," he's stiff, formal but direct. "Mr. Morse," Adeline said, with the composed pleasantness of a woman who was raised to be courteous to people regardless of whether they deserved it. Something crossed Morse's face. He nodded once tightly and walked to the back of the store. Dunmore, who had watched this entire exchange while appearing to inventory his shelf of tobacco tins, said quietly, without looking up, "The McKinley brothers were in yesterday. Said they'd been asked to sign something by Hartman's foreman." He paused. "They didn't sign." Caleb looked at him. "Thought you'd want to know," Dunmore said. Still not looking up. "That's all. They were leaving the store when it happened." Hartman's foreman, a broad, flat-faced man named Gus Deller, who had been with Hartman for 12 years and functioned as the instrument of things Hartman wanted done, without his direct involvement, was standing on the boardwalk outside. He was not alone. 2 men flanked him, and Caleb recognized both of them as the Doyle brothers, who were exactly what Pete had described them as being. Deller looked at Caleb. He looked at Adeline. He didn't speak immediately. He was the kind of man who used silence as a form of pressure. which worked on people who were uncertain of where they stood. Caleb was not uncertain. Deller, he said, walking toward him without slowing. Deller stepped slightly to the left, not dramatically. Not fully out of the way, but enough to make it unclear whether it was intentional. Caleb stopped. They stood 3 feet apart on the boardwalk, and the two Doyle brothers adjusted their positions in the particular way of men who have been told to be visible. "Your herd moved last night," Deller said. Flat, informational. Letting Caleb know that he knew. "Ranch management," Caleb said. "Not your concern. Mr. Hartman's concerned about the fence line," Deller said. "The disputed section. He'd like it surveyed before any cattle disturb the boundary markers. The land claim was filed to harass," Caleb said. "You know that. I know that. Your boss knows that. Webb knows that, and he'll file the paperwork to have it dismissed before the month is out." He looked at Deller steadily. "Is there something else?" Deller's eyes moved to Adeline. She was standing slightly behind Caleb's right shoulder, and she was looking at Deller with the expression she had worn in the courtroom direct. Composed entirely without fear, which Caleb knew cost her something even if she would never say so. "Ma'am," Deller said. The word had nothing courteous in it. "Mr. Deller," Adeline said. Hers did. Something flickered across Deller's face. He looked back at Caleb. "Mr. Hartman's a patient man," he said. "But patience has a shape. Comes a point where the shape changes. Tell your patient man," Caleb said, "that I found the shape of his patience on my north ridge 3 nights ago. Tell him we counted his patience, and then we moved what matters. And there is nothing on that ridge worth looking at anymore." He paused. "And tell him that the next time he sends men to watch my property, I'll be sending a formal complaint to the territorial marshal's office." "Not to Greer." To another pause. "We done?" Deller looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped aside fully this time, deliberately, and Caleb walked past him, and Adeline walked beside him, and the Doyle brothers did not move, but they did not touch anyone either. And that was the calculation Hartman had made not yet. Not in the open, not where it could be witnessed and reported. They were halfway down the street when Adeline said, "Quietly, your hand." His right hand, which had been open and easy at his side, had at some point during the conversation with Deller formed itself into a fist. He opened it deliberately, flexed the fingers. "I didn't realize," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I said it." He looked at her. "You were angry," she said simply. "You had every right to be. But angry men make mistakes in front of men who are looking for an excuse." She looked at him with the dark, clear eyes that saw everything he did not perform. "You didn't make a mistake. I wanted you to know I noticed." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then, after a pause entirely, she kept walking, kept her face forward, kept her voice low. "He's not going to stop because of the court ruling. He's not going to stop because of Greer's statement, or Webb's arguments, or the 12 witnesses who didn't sign." She looked at the street ahead of them. "He's going to stop when it costs him something he actually values. And I don't know what that is yet." "His reputation," Caleb said. She looked at him. "The court ruling is public record," he said. "Webb's filing went into the Billings Gazette. He told me he was going to send it there. I should have mentioned it. And the Gazette feeds to the Helena Independent, which feeds to papers in Denver and St. Louis." He paused. "Wesley Hartman has business interests in 3 states. He sells cattle to buyers in Chicago. He has a line of credit with a bank in St. Louis, whose senior partners read the Helena Independent." He looked at her. "A man who files a custody claim against an adult woman and has it dismissed as frivolous by a territorial judge is not a man whose business partners sleep easily." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "Since the courtroom," he said, "when Fenn used the word frivolous. I saw Hartman's face when Fenn said it. That was the moment that actually landed." He looked at her. "Not the ruling itself, the word, because frivolous means foolish. and the one thing Wesley Hartman cannot afford to be seen as by the people who matter to his business is foolish. She was very still. Webb already sent the filing to the Gazette? She asked. This morning before we left Billings, Caleb said. He asked my permission and I gave it. He paused. I should have told you first. I'm telling you now. She thought about it. He waited. Good, she said. They were almost back to the wagon when they heard the raised voice. It was coming from the alley between the feed store and the blacksmith's. And the voice belonged to a man Caleb recognized, Franklin Cole, who was one of the 12 names on Hartman's witness list. Franklin ran a small sheep operation 3 miles south of town. He was 40, with a family and a note at Morse's bank, and the permanent expression of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for slightly too long. The voice he was raised at belonged to Gus Deller. Caleb stopped. Adeline stopped beside him. They were at the mouth of the alley and they could hear clearly without being seen. The statement stands, Deller was saying, and his voice had the flat, mechanical quality of a man delivering a message he has delivered many times. Mr. Hartman's aware of the ruling. It changes nothing. Your name is on a legal document and it stays there. The ruling changes everything, Franklin Cole said. His voice was unsteady fear and something fighting fear in about equal measure. The judge dismissed. The judge ruled on one specific question, Deller said. Your statement is part of a separate record. It doesn't disappear because Hartman lost the injunction. If you go public with any attempt to retract it, Mr. Hartman will call your note at Morse's bank. $700. Franklin, due in full within 30 days. A pause. You don't have $700. Silence. No, Franklin said. His voice was smaller. Then we're done, Deller said. Caleb stepped into the alley. Deller turned. He was not surprised, not genuinely. Anyway, he had the reflexes of a man who was always anticipating the possibility of an audience. Franklin Cole turned too. His face when he saw Caleb was a complicated thing, relief and shame and fear in proportions that shifted as Caleb looked at him. Franklin, Caleb said. He ignored Deller entirely. He spoke to Franklin as if Deller were not there, which was its own kind of statement. I heard what he said. Franklin's face worked. Caleb. I had to. He was I know, Caleb said. I know why you signed it. I'm not here to judge that. He paused. But I need to tell you something. Webb is filing to have the coordinated statements flagged in the court record. When that goes through, your name being on that list is a liability, not a protection, because a coordinated false statement is not a neutral act. It's an exposure. He held Franklin's eyes. The banknote is $700. I have $700, not liquid, but I can get it. If Hartman calls that note, you come to me. Franklin stared at him. You'd do that. I would, Caleb said. Because you signed that statement because you were scared. And being scared is human, but it shouldn't cost you everything. He paused. And because I need the people in this town to understand that Hartman is not the only force operating here. He turned and looked at Deller. Deller's face was very still. The filing goes to the Gazette today, Caleb said. The word frivolous is going to appear in every business paper between here and St. Louis within the week. Whatever Wesley Hartman has asked you to do on his behalf, I'd think very carefully about how that looks on your own record when the dust settles. He paused. I've said what I came to say. He turned and walked out of the alley. Adeline was waiting at the entrance. She had heard everything. She fell into step beside him without speaking. They walked to the wagon. He helped her up and climbed up himself and took the reins. They were out of town and back on the road home before either of them spoke. Franklin Cole is going to retract his statement, she said. Maybe, Caleb said. Maybe not. But he's going to think about it differently now. And Deller's going to tell Hartman what you said. That was the point, Caleb said. She was quiet for a moment. You put yourself in front of him today. Directly, visibly, she looked at him. That changes the calculation for Hartman. He's been operating on the assumption that you'll absorb pressure and stay quiet. You've just told him you won't. I know, Caleb said. It might make things worse before they get better. I know that too. She looked at the road ahead of them. The sky was the particular pale gray of a Montana afternoon in early spring. The kind of gray that was not threatening but was not promising either. A sky in the middle of deciding something. I'm not afraid, she said. I know, he said. I want you to know I mean that literally. Not as a performance. She looked at him. I was afraid when I got off that train. I was afraid when Greer came to the property. I was even afraid in the courtroom. Underneath everything else, she paused. I'm not afraid now. And I've been trying to understand why, and I think it's because. She stopped. Because, he said. Because I trust you, she said. The words were simple and direct and completely without decoration. I trust your judgment, and I trust your character, and I trust that you will not make decisions that put us at risk without telling me first and asking what I think. She looked at him steadily. That's new for me. That's not something I've had before. A pause. I wanted to say it out loud. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily under them. The road unrolled ahead. Adeline, he said. Yes? I've been thinking about the wedding, he said. She blinked. The shift was abrupt enough that it caught her off guard, which he suspected was at least partly intentional. What about it? I think we should do it before the spring drive, he said. Webb can handle the paperwork. Reverend Hale will perform it or he won't. But there's a justice of the peace in Billings who owes me no particular ill will. He paused. Legally married is a different position than engaged. It changes what Hartman can do, practically speaking. A wife has different standing than a. He paused, looking for the right word. A woman living in a man's house, she said. Yes, he said. That. She looked at him. You're proposing again. I proposed once, he said. You said yes. This is logistics. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, before the spring drive is 6 weeks? Yes, he said. That's fast. It is, he said. I don't have a dress, she said. Suitable for a wedding. Mrs. Dunmore does alterations, he said. I believe. She was quiet. He kept his eyes on the road. All right, she said. 6 weeks. He nodded. He let out a breath that was quieter than it felt. They rode in comfortable silence for a mile, and then Adeline said, Caleb, Franklin Cole has a wife and 3 children, she said. When this is over, when Hartman has run out of ways to pressure people, someone should check on them. Make sure they're all right. He looked at her. That's the kind of community this could be, she said. Not idealistic, practical. The voice of a woman who had thought about what she was building and what she wanted it to be. If the people in it decide to be that. He looked back at the road. Yeah, he said. It could. They got back to the ranch as the last light was leaving the sky. Pete came out of the barn and looked at their faces, and read them the way he read everything quickly. Accurately, without asking for more information than what he could see. Good day, he said. It was not a question. Productive, Caleb said. Pete nodded. He looked at Adeline. You eat yet? Not since this morning, she said. Got soup on, he said, and went inside. Caleb was unsaddling his horse when he found it. Tucked into the barn door frame, not nailed, just placed. Where it would be found, but where the wind would not take it. A piece of paper folded once, he opened it. It was short. 8 words in handwriting he did not recognize. Get her out. Before the drive. He's decided. No signature. Caleb stood in the barn door with the note in his hand and the last gray light dying around him. And he read it twice, and the second time he read it, the splinter in his chest, that had started with 2 riders on a ridge 3 days ago, became something larger and colder and more specific. He folded the note, he put it in his coat pocket. He walked inside. Adeline and Pete were at the table. She looked up when he came in. And she read his face the way she read everything completely. Without flinching. What is it? He sat down. He took the note from his pocket and put it on the table between them. She read it. Pete leaned over and read it. The soup was on the stove. The fire was burning. Outside in the dark Montana night. Somewhere between this ranch and Hartman's property. Something was already in motion. Who left it? Pete said. I don't know, Caleb said. Deller, Adeline said quietly. Both men looked at her. Not acting for Hartman. Acting for him, she looked at the note. A man who's been asked to do something he's done before, and is comfortable with, is not a man who leaves warning notes. A man who's been asked to do something he hasn't been asked to do before. She stopped. What did you say to him in the alley? About his own record. Caleb was quiet. You gave him a way out, she said. And this is him taking it. She looked at Caleb. Which means whatever Hartman has decided to do, even his own foreman thinks it's gone too far. The room was very still. He's decided, Pete said, reading the note again. Before the drive. He set it down. He looked at Caleb with the eyes of a man who had been in enough dangerous situations to know one when it arrived. That's not the cattle, he said. We moved the cattle. He knows that. That's you. The word sat in the air. Caleb did not look at Adeline. He did not need to. Because she spoke before he could. No, she said. Flat. Certain, we are not making decisions based on what Wesley Hartman has decided. We are making decisions based on what we decide. She looked at Caleb directly. You said we deal with it together. That was the position. I'm holding you to it. I'm not leaving, she said. Don't ask me to. He hadn't said anything. She had read the thought before it became words. Which was something that happened between them now, with a frequency that still surprised him. All right, he said. All right, she said. Pete picked up the note. He folded it and put it in his own pocket. I'll ride to Greer in the morning, he said. Man to man. Show him this. Ask him directly what he's going to do about it. He paused. And if the answer's nothing, then we know, and we plan accordingly. Caleb nodded. Eat your soup, Pete said to both of them. Can't deal with anything on an empty stomach. Adeline picked up her spoon. Caleb picked up his. Outside, the dark pressed against the cabin walls the same as it always did. Indifferent and vast and cold. But inside, the three people at that table were not indifferent. And that, in the end, was the only advantage that had ever mattered. Pete rode to Greer before dawn. Caleb heard him leave, the careful sound of a man trying not to wake anyone. Boots on the floor, the quiet creak of the barn door. Hooves going soft on packed snow. He lay in the dark and listened to it, and then he got up. Because there was no version of this morning where he was going to lie still and wait. Adeline was already in the kitchen. She had the fire going and the coffee on, and she was sitting at the table with the note in front of her. Pete's pocket apparently had not been as secure as he'd intended reading it, the way she read things that mattered. Which was slowly and completely, and with her full attention. She looked up when Caleb came in. Sit down, she said. He sat. She pushed the coffee toward him. He took it. They sat across from each other in the early dark, the way they had sat across from each other on the first night. Except that everything between them was different now, deeper. More certain, carrying the weight of everything they had been through together. I've been thinking, she said. Tell me, he said. Hartman's pattern, she said. Every move he's made has been about control through fear. The legal filings fear. The bank pressure fear. The riders on the ridge fear. She looked at the note. But Deller left this warning, which means even inside Hartman's own operation. The plan has people uncomfortable. She paused. What's he planning that makes his own foreman nervous enough to warn us? Caleb had been thinking about the same question since last night. Not the cattle, he said. We established that. Not another legal filing. Webb's already positioned to counter it, and Hartman knows the judge won't hear another frivolous motion. He looked at the note. Before the drive, that's the time frame. He paused. The drive means buyers, contracts, money moving. If something happened to me before the drive, he stopped. She had gone very still, she said quietly. Without you, who holds the deed? He looked at her. Who inherits this property if something happens to you? She said. Her voice was precise and factual, and the emotion underneath it was locked down hard. The way she locked things down when they were too important to let loose in the wrong moment. Currently, he said, my brother in Ohio. We've never updated the deed since I filed the original claim. He paused. But if we marry before the drive, it becomes mine, she said. And I am not a man Hartman can pressure, intimidate, or buy out with a mortgage note. I have no debts in this county. I have nothing he holds. She looked at him steadily. He knows that too. The kitchen was very quiet. He's not planning to take the ranch, Caleb said slowly. He's planning to take me out of it in a way that leaves it vulnerable. A widow in 1888, with a contested deed and no male heir, and a neighbor willing to make a generous offer for a property she can't operate alone. He stopped. The buyers walk away. The note comes due on the operating loans. The widow sells, Adeline said. At a price he sets, Caleb said. They looked at each other across the table. We get married this week, Caleb said. Not a question, not a hesitation. I'll wire the justice of the peace in Billings this morning. He stood up. And I'm going to write to my brother today. Tell him to expect a letter from Webb about the deed transfer. He looked at her. I should have done all of this already. You were managing everything else already, she said. That's not an excuse, she said. But it's true. She stood up. She picked up the note and walked to the fire and dropped it in. And they both watched it catch and go. Pete will be back by noon. We'll know what Greer intends by then. She turned from the fire. Until then, I need you to do something for me. Name it, he said. Eat breakfast, she said. Properly. You've been running on coffee and urgency for 2 days, and you need to be sharp today. She moved toward the stove. Sit down, he almost argued. He looked at her face and decided against it. He sat down. She made eggs, real ones from the 3 hens that had survived the winter, which she treated as a minor triumph of domestic resilience every time they produced. She made biscuits that she'd had rising since before he woke up, which meant she'd been awake longer than he'd realized, which meant she'd been doing the same calculations in the dark that he'd been doing. He ate. It was good. It was always good. You're thinking about all of this the same way I am, he said. Halfway through the biscuits. I've been thinking about it since the note, she said, sitting across from him with her own plate. Since before the note. Honestly, since the hearing, since Billings, she looked at her food. When a man like Hartman loses in public, the question isn't whether he retaliates. It's when and how. She paused. I've been afraid of the answer since we drove home from the courthouse. You said you weren't afraid, he said. I said I wasn't afraid of standing beside you, she said. That's different. She looked up. I'm afraid of losing you. Those are not the same fear. The words landed in the space between them and stayed there. Simple and complete. He set down his fork. He looked at her across the table, this who had come to him out of a storm, nothing but a broken trunk and $12, and the particular ferocious dignity of someone who had survived everything life had thrown at her so far, and he felt something move through him that he had no adequate language for. Which was fine, because he was not a man who required language for everything. You're not going to lose me, he said. You don't know that, she said. No, he said. But I know I intend to be very difficult to get rid of. He held her eyes. And I know I'm going to marry you in 4 days and put your name on this deed and make sure that whatever Hartman is planning runs into a wall he didn't account for. He paused. And I know that the 2 of us sitting at this table is the thing I'm most certain of right now. Which is saying something, because I'm not a man who's certain of very many things. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her fork. 4 days, she said. 4 days, he said. Pete came back at 11:30. And his face when he rode into the yard told Caleb everything before he'd dismounted. Greer's done, Pete said, coming through the door and pulling off his coat. He said it without preamble, because there was no version of this news that benefited from gentle introduction. Not corrupt, I want to be clear about that. But done. He told me this morning he's resigning the position end of month. His wife's been after him to go to her sister's in Oregon for 2 years, and he's finally saying yes. He sat down. He showed me something before I left. Hartman was at the sheriff's office yesterday evening. After we went to town, he was there for an hour. Pete looked at Caleb directly. Greer wouldn't tell me what was said, but he told me that whatever I was worried about, I should be worried about it before Friday. Friday was 3 days away. The Doyle brothers, Caleb said. Has to be, Pete said. Deller's out the note proves that. Hartman doesn't have the stomach to do anything himself. But the Doyles have done worse than this for less money, and they know this territory. He paused. And Greer's resignation means whoever comes after him interim, appointed by the county, will likely be someone Hartman recommends, which means after Friday. The law in Harrow Creek belongs to Hartman, Adeline said from the doorway of her room, where she had been listening. Both men looked at her. She came to the table and sat down. So we have 3 days to settle everything that needs settling before the legal landscape changes. She looked at Caleb. Wire billings this morning. Justice of the peace. Tomorrow, if he can manage it. Webb handles the deed paperwork. She looked at Pete. Can you reach Tom Brennan today? I can reach him by 2, Pete said. Ask him to hold the herd through the weekend. We push the drive date back by 5 days. Buyers in Chicago can wait 5 days, she looked at Pete. And I need you to go back to town this afternoon. Not to the Franklin Cole. Pete waited. Franklin has a wife, she said, Clara Cole. She and Franklin have been in Harrow Creek 8 years. She knows things. Women who have lived in a town for 8 years know things that men in that town have never noticed. She paused. I need to know if there's anything she knows about what Hartman is actually planning. About the Doyle brothers specifically, where they've been, who they've talked to. She looked at Pete. A wife talks to Clara Cole differently than a ranch hand talks to Franklin. Pete looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Adeline. You want to go with Pete, he said. No, she said. I want to go alone. Pete can drive me to town and wait at Dunmore's. She held up a hand before either of them could speak. I know what you're going to say. But Clara Cole is not going to open up about her husband's business in front of a strange man. She will open up to another woman, and specifically to me. Because I am the only other person in this county who has been publicly humiliated by Wesley Hartman and survived it. She paused. She'll talk to me. The table was quiet. Pete looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Adeline. 2 hours, he said. Pete stays within sight of wherever you are. Agreed, she said. And you come back at the first sign of anything wrong, he said. I mean anything. Agreed, she said again. And then she looked at him with the eyes that saw through everything he performed and into everything he actually was. And she said quietly, I'll come back. He believed her. That was the thing, he absolutely believed her. And the belief sat in his chest like something warm and unshakable, which was a new sensation for a man who had spent 12 years not trusting that anything good was permanent. They left for town at noon. Caleb spent the 2 hours they were gone wiring the justice of the peace in Billings, writing to his brother in Ohio, and doing the 2 things he'd been putting off: oiling and loading the rifle that lived above the fireplace, and cleaning the revolver in his bedside drawer. He did both tasks with the methodical calm of a man who hoped the tools would not be needed and was not willing to need them and find them wanting. He was at the kitchen table when he heard the wagon. He was at the door when it stopped. Adeline climbed down before Pete could help her. She walked to the door, and he stepped back to let her in. And she came past him and went directly to the table and sat down. And her face had something in it that was neither fear nor triumph, but was the expression of a woman who has learned something significant and is organizing it into words. Clara Cole talked to me, she said. He sat across from her. Pete came in behind him and closed the door. The Doyle brothers haven't been staying at Hartman's property, she said. They've been at a homestead cabin 4 miles northeast of here. Empty property. The family that owned it went back east 3 years ago. Hartman pays the back taxes to keep the claim in limbo. She paused. Clara knows because Franklin has been losing sleep. He heard the Doyle brothers talking at the feed store 2 weeks ago, and he heard them mention the cabin, and he told Clara. She looked at Caleb. They're not planning to hurt you directly. That's too visible. Too traceable. She paused. They're planning to burn the barn. The air in the room changed. With the cattle gone, the barn is the second most valuable thing on this property, she said. Her voice was controlled, but her hands on the table were pressed flat in the way they pressed when she was managing something serious. Barn fire in the night looks like accident, no cattle. No barn, operating income gone for the season. You're forced to take loans you can't service. And Hartman's there with a purchase offer inside the month. She looked at him. Clara didn't know when, but Franklin heard them say before the drive, before Friday. Pete said something very quiet and very specific that was not appropriate for mixed company. Caleb stood up. He went to the window and stood looking at the barn. Not because there was anything to see, but because he needed a moment to take the information and make it into a plan rather than a reaction. He was a man who had learned that the space between receiving bad news and responding to it was the most important space there was. He turned around. Tonight, he said. Both of them looked at him. If I were them, I'd do it tonight, he said. Before word gets around that we know. Before anything changes. He looked at Pete. Can you reach Brennan? Get him and 2 of his boys out here by dark? I can reach him by 3, Pete said. He was already moving toward his coat. And on your way, stop at McKinley's. Jim McKinley didn't sign Hartman's statement. He's been quiet, but he's been quiet on our side of the line. Ask him to come tonight. Tell him why. Pete was already at the door. Anyone else? Dunmore, Caleb said. Marcus Dunmore's shotgun he's been polishing for 20 years without using it. Tonight he uses it or he watches. Either one is fine. Pete nodded once and left. Caleb looked at Adeline. You're going to tell me to stay inside tonight, she said. I'm going to ask you to stay inside tonight, he said. There's a difference. I'm asking. She looked at him. Why? Because if something goes wrong and you're outside, I can't do what I need to do and watch you at the same time, he said. And I need to do what I need to do. He paused. That's not about your capability. You know that. She was quiet for a moment. You'll tell me everything that happens. Everything, he said. The moment it's over. The moment it's over, he said. She nodded. All right. She stood up and went to the kitchen. Because she was a woman who dealt with impossible situations by doing the next useful thing. And the next useful thing was feeding the people who were going to stand in a dark yard tonight and wait for men who meant harm. By 5 o'clock, Tom Brennan was there with his 2 eldest sons, both of whom were large, quiet men who had grown up on the Montana frontier and had the calm, competent bearing of people who had dealt with difficult things before and expected to deal with difficult things again. Jim McKinley came at 5:30. Marcus Dunmore arrived at 6 with his shotgun and a determination on his face that suggested he had made a private decision that had been building for some time. They ate the meal Adeline had made all of them, crowded around Caleb's kitchen table, in a way the table had never been used, and she served it without performance and without drama, moving efficiently in the small space, refilling cups. And when Tom Brennan's younger son, who was 19 and hadn't quite got control of his nerves, knocked his cup over, she cleaned it up before he could fully apologize and said, "Don't worry about it. Eat your supper," in the voice of a woman who had cooked for people in crisis before and knew exactly how much the ordinary mattered when the extraordinary was waiting outside. Dunmore watched her. Caleb noticed him watching. When the meal was done and Adeline had gone to her room at Caleb's quiet request and the bolt had gone on the inside of the door, he heard it. The small certain sound of it, and something in him settled, Dunmore said to Caleb, quietly enough that the others didn't hear. "She's something, that woman." "Yes," Caleb said. "I owe her an apology," Dunmore said, "for the first weeks. I should have been clearer about where I stood. Tell her that yourself, Caleb said. She'll appreciate hearing it from you directly. He paused. Tomorrow, Dunmore nodded. Tomorrow, he agreed. They positioned themselves at 9 o'clock, when the dark was complete and the cold had settled in fully, and the ranch was as quiet as a ranch gets, which was not entirely quiet, because barns and animals and wind never produce silence, but was quiet enough that footsteps would carry, that the sound of men approaching on foot would be detectable if you were listening with the right kind of attention. Caleb stood at the corner of the barn. Pete was at the far end. Brennan's sons were at the fence line to the north and east, respectively. McKinley was behind the woodpile, with a clear sight line to the main approach. Dunmore was on the porch with his shotgun, and the look of a man who had decided, somewhere between his supply store and this porch, that some things were more important than the caution he'd been practicing for 30 years. They waited. The waiting was the hardest part, it always was. A man standing still in cold dark with the knowledge that something is coming has to manage his own mind. Has to keep it from running ahead into scenarios that haven't happened yet. Has to stay present in the current moment while being fully prepared for the next one. Caleb managed it the way he managed most things, by paying attention to exactly what was in front of him. No more and no less. The temperature of the air on his face. The sound of the horses in the barn, familiar and ordinary. The faint smell of smoke from the cabin chimney. The feel of the rifle in his hands. Its weight known and reliable. He was thinking about Adeline behind the bolted door. He was thinking about 4 days. He heard them at 10:30. 2 sets of footsteps, coming from the northeast, which was exactly the direction of the empty homestead cabin Clara Cole had told Adeline about. They were trying to move quietly, and they were reasonably good at it. The Doyle brothers had done this kind of thing before, but there were 2 or 2 of them, and the ground between the tree line and the barn had a particular crunch to it that no amount of care could entirely suppress. Caleb waited until they were 20 feet from the barn door. Then he stepped out of the shadow and said, "That's far enough." The effect was immediate and significant. The Doyle brothers stopped. The older one, Roy, Caleb thought, though he'd only seen them at a distance, went for the bag he was carrying, which Caleb was willing to bet contained lamp oil. "I wouldn't," Pete said, from the far end of the barn. His voice was calm and old and entirely without excitement, which was somehow more threatening than excitement would have been. The 2 men looked around. McKinley stepped up from the woodpile. Brennan's sons moved in from the fence line. Dunmore stood up on the porch. 6 against 2. Both brothers understood the arithmetic immediately. The older one set the bag down, slowly, carefully. The movement of a man making a smart decision under pressure. "There's lamp oil in that bag," Caleb said, "and I'm going to guess there are matches somewhere on both of you." He looked at them steadily. "That's intent. That's not trespassing or mischief, that's arson. With witnesses. Roy, Dan, I'm going to ask you one question and I want a true answer. Did Wesley Hartman send you here tonight?" Silence. "Roy," Caleb said, "I am not your enemy and I never was. Hartman is the man who put you in this yard, with a bag of oil and witnesses on every side. Whatever he paid you, it's not enough for what happens next if you don't answer me honestly." He paused. "Did he send you?" The older brother looked at the younger brother. Something passed between them, the rapid, wordless communication of men who have known each other all their lives. "Yes," Roy Doyle said. McKinley exhaled behind the woodpile. Dunmore made a sound that was not quite a word. "There's a territorial marshal's office in Helena," Caleb said. "I'm going to write them a letter in the morning. I'm going to tell them what happened here tonight, with 6 witness signatures, and I'm going to give them Wesley Hartman's name." He looked at them. "You 2 are going to leave Harrow Creek tonight, and you're not going to come back. And if you're ever asked about this by anyone with legal authority, you're going to tell the truth about who hired you and what for." He paused. "Or I can have Pete take you into what's left of the sheriff's office right now, and we can do this the harder way." Another look between the brothers. "We'll go," Dan Doyle said. It was the first time he'd spoken. His voice was younger than his face. "We'll go tonight." "Good," Caleb said. He stepped aside. "Leave the bag." They left the bag. They walked back the way they'd come, quickly, without looking back. The footsteps crunching away into the dark until they were gone, and the yard was quiet again. The 6 men stood in the dark for a moment. Then Tom Brennan said, "Well," in the tone of a man completing a sentence that didn't need any other words. "Grateful to all of you," Caleb said. Genuinely. He looked at each of them. Brennan. His sons, McKinley, Dunmore. "This won't be forgotten. Hartman's been needing this for a while," McKinley said. He said it simply, without drama, the statement of a man who had been waiting to say it in the right context. Glad it finally came. Dunmore walked down from the porch. He stood in front of Caleb and stuck out his hand. Caleb shook it. "Letter to the marshal goes out tomorrow," Dunmore said. "You put my name on it, I will," Caleb said. They filtered out one by one until it was just Caleb and Pete standing in the yard. Pete looked at the bag of lamp oil sitting in the snow. "Close thing," Caleb said. "What happens to Hartman now?" Caleb looked at the bag too. "The marshal's letter. The Gazette story. The Billings ruling on record." He paused. "The Doyle brothers talking, which they will, because men who've been left exposed always talk eventually." He looked at Pete. "And 6 men who stood in this yard tonight and will remember it every time Hartman tries to move in this county again." He paused. "He doesn't disappear. Men like him rarely do. But he loses the thing he needs most, the belief in other people's minds that crossing him is more dangerous than standing up to him." He looked at the cabin where the light was still on behind Adeline's window. "Once that belief is gone, it doesn't come back." Pete was quiet for a moment. "She figured out the barn," he said, "before any of us." "She did," Caleb said. "And the Doyle brothers' position. And Clara Cole." Pete paused. "She figured out most of this." "She did," Caleb said again. He was looking at the window. Pete looked at it too. He looked at Caleb. He said nothing, because he was a man who knew when nothing was the right thing to say. And this was one of those times. He went to the bunkhouse. Caleb went to the cabin door. He knocked twice. Their signal, established without discussion on the night the note appeared. The bolt slid back. She opened the door and looked at him. And her eyes moved over his face with the rapid, practiced attention of a woman reading for the thing that mattered most. "It's done," he said. She exhaled, one breath long and complete. She stepped back from the door, and he came inside, and she closed it behind him. "The Doyle brothers," she said. "Gone," he said. "They confirmed Hartman hired them. 6 witnesses heard it. The marshal's letter goes out tomorrow, with Dunmore's name on it and McKinley's and Brennan's." She was quiet. She stood in the middle of the cabin in the firelight, with her arms crossed over herself, not defensively. He'd learned, but the way she held herself when something large was settling, and she needed a moment for it to settle. "It's not over," she said. "Not completely. Hartman is going to spend the next several months managing what's in the Gazette and what's going to the marshal's office and what 6 men are saying in town," Caleb said. "He'll be too occupied to be a threat to us." He looked at her. "But long enough." "Long enough for what?" she said. "For us to build something he can't touch," Caleb said. "For the drive. For the deed to go through. For the town to settle into a new version of itself that doesn't need his approval to function." He paused. "For the things worth building to get built." She looked at him. The firelight was behind her, and her face was in the particular warm shadow that firelight makes. And she looked exactly like herself, all the parts of her. The sharp intelligence and the careful dignity and the fierce, capable love that she distributed without announcement to anyone lucky enough to be in its path, and he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that Wesley Hartman calling her plain was the most expensive mistake the man had ever made. 4 days, she said. 4 days, he said. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she said, "You should sleep. You've been awake since before Pete left this morning." "You have too," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going now." She turned toward her room. She stopped at the doorway and looked back at him. "Caleb." "Yeah," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for coming back." He looked at her. "I'll always come back," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once the nod of a woman filing something important in the place where she keeps things she intends to rely on. She went to her room. The bolt went on the door. He stood at the fire for a while. He thought about the morning his father had told him that the most valuable things in a man's life were the things he chose and kept choosing, not the things that came easy. He thought about 12 years of silence in this cabin. The particular weight of it, the way he had organized his life around the absence of anything that could leave, and therefore hurt. He thought about a woman on her knees in the snow and 30 people walking past. He had walked toward her. He was still walking toward her. He banked the fire and went to his room and slept better than he had in weeks. 4 days later, on a morning that came in clear and cold and brilliant with the particular brightness of early Montana spring, Caleb Whitaker married Adeline Mercer in a simple ceremony in the main room of the cabin, with a justice of the peace from Billings, Pete Garner, as witness, and Marcus Dunmore and his wife standing by the door, because Dunmore had come to deliver what he'd promised, an apology. Direct and honest, man to woman, and had been invited to stay. Adeline wore a dress that Mrs. Dunmore had altered over 2 evenings with a speed and care that was its own kind of statement about where the town's sympathies had settled. It was not a wedding dress in the conventional sense. It was dark blue, well made, the kind of dress a woman wears when she wants to look like herself at her finest rather than like an occasion. She looked, Caleb thought, like herself at her finest. When the justice asked her whether she took this man freely and of her own choosing, she said yes without hesitation and with the particular certainty of a woman who knows the difference between choosing freely and being left without options, because she had lived both. When he asked Caleb the same, Caleb said yes and looked at her while he said it, which she would remember later as the moment that was completely and irreducibly him. The justice signed the certificate. Pete signed as witness. Dunmore shook Caleb's hand and then turned to Adeline and said, carefully and directly, "I should have been clearer about where I stood from the beginning. I'm sorry I wasn't." And Adeline looked at him and said, "You're here now. That's what matters," which was, Pete told Tom Brennan later, the most graceful thing he'd ever heard a person say to someone who deserved to be said something considerably less graceful. The letter to the territorial marshal went out the same day. 3 weeks later, the Billings Gazette ran a second story not about the original ruling, but about the complaint filed with the marshal's office, signed by 6 residents of Harrow Creek County, detailing an attempted arson and the named parties behind it. The Helena Independent ran it the following week. A paper in Denver ran a condensed version 10 days after that. Wesley Hartman did not attend town meetings for 2 months. His lawyer Cartwright filed to withdraw from his representation shortly after the marshal's inquiry began. One of his Chicago cattle buyers quietly terminated their standing contract pending the outcome of the inquiry, citing concerns about business stability. The Doyle brothers were never seen in Harrow Creek again. Franklin Cole came to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. While Caleb was in the Southfield and Adeline was at the kitchen table writing a letter to Thomas. He knocked. She opened the door. He stood on the step with his hat in his hands and said, "I need to tell you something." And she said, "Come in." And she made coffee, and she listened to him tell her that he had filed a retraction of his signed statement with Webb's office in Billings, and that he understood it was late, and that he was sorry it had taken him this long. She looked at him across the table. "You were protecting your family," she said. "I understand that," he said. "No," she said. But it was human. She refilled his cup. "How's Clara?" He looked startled. "She's well," he said. She'd like to call on you." "If that's all right." "Tell her Thursday," Adeline said. "I'll make something." Franklin Cole left looking like a man who had put down something he'd been carrying for months, which was exactly what he'd done. The spring drive went out on a Thursday in early May, 5 days behind the original schedule, with 83 head and 2 hired hands and Pete Garner running flank. The buyers in Chicago took the herd at market rate with no dispute and no delay. The income settled the operating account for the year and left a margin that Caleb had not had in 3 seasons. He came home to a cabin with light in the window. He came home to coffee on the stove and a book on the table and a woman who looked up when he came in and said, "How did it go?" in the voice of someone who was fully invested in the answer. "Well," he said. "It went well," she smiled, real and warm and still quick, still slightly surprised at itself, the way it had been from the beginning. Which he had decided was one of the things he intended to spend the rest of his life being grateful for. That summer, Thomas Mercer came east from Nevada. He stayed 3 weeks. He was a lean, good-humored man with his sister's eyes and a laugh that filled whatever room he was standing in. And on the last evening before he went back, he sat on the porch with Caleb in the dark and said, "She wrote me about you. Before all of it. Before the courtroom and the barn and everything." He paused. "She said you were the most honest person she'd met since our mother." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant thing to be measured against," he said. "It is," Thomas said. "She doesn't measure against our mother lightly." He looked at the dark field. "Take care of her." "I intend to," Caleb said. "I know," Thomas said. "That's why I could go back." In the years that followed, the ranch grew steadily the way things grow, when the right people tend them, not dramatically. Not all at once, but year by year, in the accumulation of good decisions and honest work, and the particular compound interest of 2 people building toward the same thing. A second barn went up. Pete Garner did not go to California. He stayed, because a man who has found a place where his presence matters does not leave it lightly. And he had found that place. Harrow Creek changed too. The way small towns change slowly, with resistance and then accommodation, and then the eventual incorporation of new realities, as if they had always been that way. The Whitaker Ranch became a known quantity, a stable point in the county. The kind of operation that other operations measured themselves against. Adeline's Thursday visits with Clara Cole became a fixture. The women's circle that had once turned away from her on a train platform invited her to join, and she declined. Politely and without rancor, which was received as the graceful thing it was. Wesley Hartman retained his land and most of his money. The territorial inquiry found insufficient evidence for criminal prosecution, which Webb had predicted and which Caleb had accepted, because the law was what it was, and the goal had never been his destruction. What the inquiry cost Hartman was subtler and more permanent. The Chicago buyers did not return. The St. Louis credit line was renegotiated at less favorable terms. And the men of Harrow Creek County never again moved quite so automatically to accommodate his preferences. He remained large. He did not remain unchallenged. He never spoke to Adeline again. He never tried. On the evening of their 3rd anniversary, Caleb and Adeline sat on the porch in the last of the spring light, a habit they had developed in the first summer and maintained through every season since, and she was reading a letter from Thomas about a woman he'd met in Carson City, and Caleb was looking at the field and thinking about the next season's decisions. And the silence between them was the comfortable kind. The kind that does not need to be filled because it is already full. She looked up from the letter. She looked at him. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "The north fence," he said. I know what the north fence needs," she said. "I've been telling you since February." "You have," he agreed. She looked at him the way she had looked at him across every table and every distance, and every difficult moment of the 3 years they had been building this together directly. Completely, with nothing held back and nothing hidden. "Are you happy?" she said. She asked it the way she asked everything that mattered, simply. Directly, wanting the true answer rather than the comfortable one. He looked at the field. He looked at the barn. He looked at the cabin behind them, with its firelight and its books and its 2 chairs that had started as strangers and become a pair. He looked at her. Yes, he said. No elaboration, no qualification. The plain and certain truth of a man who had spent 12 years not knowing what he was missing, and had spent 3 years since in full knowledge of exactly what he had found. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, the same nod she had given him on their wedding night when he said he would always come back, the nod of a woman, filing something in the place where she keeps things she intends to rely on forever. She went back to Thomas's letter. He went back to looking at the field. And the Montana evening settled around them, indifferent as it had always been to the small, warm things happening in it. And neither of them noticed the indifference, because they were too busy being exactly where they had chosen to be. Some love stories begin with perfect circumstances. This one began with a woman in the snow and a man who decided to walk toward her when everyone else walked away. It grew in the space between a kitchen table and a fireplace, in the accumulation of honest words and shared silences, and the daily choice made without announcement, made again and again and again to stand beside each other when standing alone would have been easier. It survived storms. It survived men with money and lawyers and writers on ridges. It survived the long, cold patience of a world that does not always make room for the right things without a fight. It survived because they decided it would, and that decision, made first in a snowstorm and remade every morning after, was the strongest thing either of them had ever built.